Welcome, friend. Close your eyes and imagine another time. A conflict that shaped nations, families, and futures. In this gentle retelling, we'll explore the events and voices of that era softly, steadily, so you can relax as history tells its story. Let's begin. The first thing to understand about Constantinople in the 15th century is this: it was living history. A relic, a ghost, and yet, astonishingly, still alive. Imagine walking its streets in the early 1400s. You wouldn't see the bustling, glittering capital of emperors and traders that once dazzled medieval travelers. Instead, you'd find a tired city, scarred by wars and sieges, surviving more on memory than on muscle. The Byzantine Empire had once stretched across the Mediterranean, but by the time of the final siege, its lands were whittled down to a few scraps: bits of Greece, the Peloponnese, and the city itself. Constantinople was no longer the heart of an empire. It was the last stubborn heartbeat of a body that had already wasted away. That fact colored every stone, every church bell, every nervous conversation whispered in its streets. To the people inside its walls, Constantinople wasn't just home. It was an inheritance. They lived among monuments older than many European kingdoms. The Theodosian walls had stood since the 5th century, an entire millennium of repelling barbarian invasions, Arab armies, Bulgar raids, and even crusaders. Think about that. Those walls had seen Attila's Huns thunder across Europe, watched the rise of Islam, heard the clash of Frankish knights, and yet remained unbroken. If you were a resident of Constantinople in 1453, you might still feel pride in that legacy. People believed the city was invincible, divinely protected even. Hagia Sophia, that soaring cathedral, was more than architecture. It was proof that God had once favored this city above all others. But at the same time, that pride carried a shadow. For centuries, prophets and preachers whispered that the city would someday fall, that its glory was destined to collapse under the weight of its enemies. And in those final years, that prophecy felt less like distant myth and more like an unpaid debt coming due. What strikes me most about Constantinople's last days is how small it had become. Historians estimate the population had dwindled to maybe 50,000 or even less by the mid-1400s. For comparison, that's fewer people than fit in a modern football stadium. At its height, Constantinople boasted 500,000 souls, markets overflowing with goods from Africa, India, and beyond. Now, whole neighborhoods lay abandoned. Houses crumbled, their gardens overtaken by weeds. Wolves and stray dogs prowled where once senators and nobles had lived. Inside the city, many districts looked more like countryside than urban sprawl, farmland within the walls, because importing food had grown so unreliable. Some families tended sheep in what had been great plazas. Imagine living inside the supposedly greatest fortress in the world, but feeling like you were living in a half-abandoned village. That contrast, between the grandeur of what was and the poverty of what remained, defined everything about those final days. We can't forget what Constantinople meant beyond its walls. To Western Europe, it was the new Rome, a surviving fragment of the old Roman Empire. That carried an enormous symbolic weight. Sure, the Byzantines spoke Greek, not Latin. Their emperors looked more like Orthodox priests than toga-clad Caesars. But the claim was clear: Rome's torch hadn't been extinguished, just passed eastward. For centuries, this claim gave Constantinople prestige. Pilgrims marveled at its relics. Kings sought its alliances. Crusaders used it as a staging ground. Yet by the 1400s, Western Europe had largely turned its back. The Catholic and Orthodox churches had split. The Crusaders themselves had sacked Constantinople in 1204, leaving wounds that never truly healed. So when the city looked west for help against the Ottomans, many European rulers hesitated. Some were busy fighting each other. Others still resented the Byzantines. And some just figured, if they've managed to survive this long, maybe they'll hold out again. That sense of isolation, that you couldn't count on the rest of Christendom to save you, haunted the final emperor, Constantine XI. He inherited not just a throne, but the impossible burden of being the last link in a chain stretching back to Augustus Caesar. Now, picture the map. By the 1450s, the Ottoman Empire had nearly swallowed the Byzantine world whole. They controlled Anatolia to the east and the Balkans to the west. Constantinople was like an island, a stubborn dot of Christian land surrounded by a Muslim sea. To trade, to farm, to even breathe, it all depended on Ottoman permission. And the Ottomans weren't just another enemy. They were an empire on the rise, organized, wealthy, and relentless. Sultan Mehmed II, young and ambitious, wasn't content to let Constantinople remain a Christian stronghold in the middle of his domains. For him, conquering the city wasn't just strategy, it was destiny. He wanted to be remembered as the man who achieved what no one before him had managed, breaking Rome's last bastion. Inside Constantinople, life teetered between hope and despair. Some people genuinely believed a miracle would save them. They clung to prophecies that angels would descend or that Western knights would arrive at the last moment. Others were more cynical, convinced that the empire's sins had doomed it. These competing mindsets created tension. Should they fight to the bitter end, or seek some sort of deal with the Ottomans? Constantine XI himself leaned toward defiance. He wasn't blind to the city's weakness, but he also understood the symbolic weight of surrender. To yield Constantinople without a fight would mean giving up the last shred of dignity the empire possessed. Better to go down in flames than to fade away quietly. In hindsight, it's easy to say Constantinople was doomed. The population was too small, the walls outdated against cannons, the empire too isolated. But history never feels inevitable in the moment. People inside those walls had seen inevitable invasions before. They had outlasted Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Crusaders. They had survived plague, famine, and civil war. Why should this time be different? That's the fascinating paradox of the city in its final days. It was both doomed and defiant, fragile and proud, crumbling and eternal. Like a candle burning at the end of its wick, it gave off one last blaze before the darkness fell. You might wonder why this matters today. After all, cities fall all the time in history. But Constantinople's fall wasn't just the end of a city. It was the end of the Middle Ages, the final act of the Roman Empire, and the opening of a new chapter in world history. When it fell, trade routes shifted, Europe panicked, and explorers looked west, leading, eventually, to Columbus and the so-called Age of Discovery. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, all we need to grasp is this. Constantinople in the mid-1400s was a city on borrowed time. Its glory was long past, its allies unreliable, its enemies circling. And yet, within those walls, people still lived, still prayed, still hoped. And that fragile hope, against overwhelming odds, is what makes the story of its fall so achingly human. When people talk about Constantinople, they almost always talk about its walls. And honestly, they deserve the attention. These weren't just walls, they were legends in stone, the kind of fortifications that became almost mythological. For 1,000 years, the Theodosian walls stood as the defining symbol of the city's survival. Every invader who tried to breach them, from Huns to Crusaders, carried away the same bitter lesson: Constantinople did not fall easily. But here's the irony: by 1453, those same walls were both the city's greatest strength and its Achilles heel. They had kept Constantinople alive for centuries, but they had also lulled its people into a dangerous kind of faith. Because when you've leaned on the same shield for 1,000 years, you start to believe it's invincible. And nothing is truly invincible. Let's picture them clearly. The Theodosian walls weren't just a single barrier. Built in the 5th century under Emperor Theodosius II, they were a layered system. A wide moat in front, then an outer wall, then a second, much higher inner wall. The whole complex stretched over 4 miles, protecting the landward side of the city where attack was most likely. The inner wall towered up to 40 feet high, punctuated by massive towers every 150 feet or so. Behind it, defenders could rain arrows, hurl rocks, or dump boiling oil. If attackers crossed the moat, they'd be trapped under fire from both walls. Siege engines that worked against lesser fortresses simply broke against this monster. And, because the walls were regularly repaired and reinforced, they looked as solid in 1453 as they had centuries before. To anyone approaching Constantinople, the sight was awe-inspiring. Imagine trudging across dusty fields with an army, and suddenly these colossal ramparts rise up ahead of you like a stone mountain range. For medieval soldiers, it was enough to sap courage before a single arrow flew. These walls didn't just protect the city, they built its legend. Over centuries, countless sieges ended with enemies humiliated, retreating with nothing but corpses and broken ladders. When the Arabs tried to conquer Constantinople in the 7th and 8th centuries, their fleets and armies battered against the Theodosian system and failed. When the Bulgars tested it, the same story unfolded. Even the mighty Rus came with ships and fury, and they too went home empty-handed. For the Byzantines, this wasn't just military luck. It was divine proof. Preachers said the Virgin Mary herself protected the city, walking its walls at night. Every failed siege became another miracle, another reassurance that Constantinople wasn't like other cities, it was chosen eternal. But legends, like walls, can calcify. By the 15th century, people still believed in the walls' magic, even as warfare changed around them. And that was the catch. The Theodosian walls were designed to stop battering rams, siege towers, catapults. They weren't designed to withstand gunpowder artillery. Cannons had been around in Europe for about a century, but now they were getting bigger, stronger, more accurate. Against stone walls built in an age before gunpowder, cannons were catastrophic. Mehmet II understood this perfectly. His secret weapon was Urban the Hungarian, an engineer who built him monstrous cannons capable of firing stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds. These weren't toys, they were city killers. When those guns opened fire on the Theodosian walls, centuries of invincibility suddenly didn't seem so certain. Still, before the first cannon shot was fired, the Byzantines placed their faith in those ramparts. After all, they had held before. Why wouldn't they hold again? Another issue. The walls were still mighty, but the empire was broke. By 1453, Constantinople didn't have the resources it once did to maintain them properly. Sure, they patched cracks, shored up weak points, but it wasn't the same kind of imperial upkeep that emperors like Justinian had commanded. Imagine trying to maintain the defenses of a city that once controlled the wealth of the Mediterranean, but now had only a few thousand taxpayers. Stones loosened. Sections eroded. The outer moat sometimes lay dry. On their own, these flaws might not have mattered, but against Mehmet's artillery, every weakness was a gift to the attackers. There's another, more psychological problem. The walls gave a sense of security so strong that it bordered on denial. Many Byzantines believed the city could never fall as long as the walls stood. That kind of thinking made it harder to confront reality. Their enemies had grown stronger, their allies fewer, their armies smaller. This misplaced faith meant that instead of investing in diplomacy, fleets, or new strategies, many inside Constantinople leaned back on the old belief: the walls will save us. And when the moment came, they discovered too late that faith in stone alone can't stand against iron and fire. What fascinates me are the little stories we get from people defending the walls during the siege. Chroniclers describe men repairing breaches by night after cannon fire shattered the stones by day. They filled gaps with rubble, barrels of earth, even broken furniture. At times, entire neighborhoods brought out materials to plug holes in the wall. Imagine tearing apart your own house to rebuild the city's shield. That's how desperate it got. And yet, there was pride too. Defending those walls wasn't just a military duty, it was a spiritual calling. Priests carried icons along the ramparts, blessing the stones, urging men to hold firm. To stand on the Theodosian walls in those final weeks was to feel you were part of a story far bigger than yourself. Here's the cruelest twist. Those walls, which had saved Constantinople for centuries, may also have doomed it in the end. Because they were so strong, the city never invested as heavily in a fleet. Because they repelled so many sieges, Europe assumed the city didn't really need saving. And because the walls seemed eternal, Byzantines themselves struggled to accept just how vulnerable they truly were. When Mehmet's cannons began pounding, it wasn't just stone that cracked. It was an entire worldview. I think that's why the image of the Theodosian walls still resonates today. They represent more than engineering. They represent the tension between human pride and human fragility. They remind us that what seems eternal can crumble in an instant, that the tools which protect us can also blind us to change. When you look at modern cities with skyscrapers and high-tech defenses, it's worth remembering Constantinople. People then also thought their fortifications were unbeatable. But history has a way of humbling human confidence. By 1453, the stage was set, a city clinging to its old defenses, a young conqueror bringing new weapons, and a world about to watch the greatest fortress of the Middle Ages face its reckoning. The walls were still there, towering and imposing. But this time, something was different. This time, stone would meet gunpowder. And once the walls cracked, so too would the myth of Constantinople's eternity. If Constantinople was a city living on borrowed time, Mehmet too was the man who came to collect the debt. His ambition wasn't just political, it was almost cosmic. He wanted to reshape the world and put his name alongside Alexander, Caesar, and all the great conquerors before him. When you look at the Ottoman Empire in the mid-15th century, you see a machine that was built to expand. It had wealth pouring in from conquered lands, soldiers hardened by constant campaigns, and a political system that thrived on victory. To a young sultan like Mehmet, Constantinople wasn't simply another city on the map. It was the jewel, the crossroads of Europe and Asia, the seat of the Roman emperors, the city that had withstood everyone else. And if he could take it, his own legend would be written in stone. Let's talk about Mehmet himself. He wasn't your average monarch. Born in 1432, he was only 21 when the siege began. That's astonishing, barely more than a boy in years, yet already shaping the destiny of empires. From a young age, he was obsessed with learning. He studied Greek, Latin, Persian, Arabic, hungry for knowledge, not just of war but of history. And in those books, he read about Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and the emperors of old. He didn't just want to rule, he wanted to surpass them. Constantinople was his chance to do it. His father, Murad II, had reigned longer and steadier, but he never dared risk the city. Too dangerous, too uncertain. Mehmet wasn't interested in caution. He was interested in glory. We might ask, why was this city so important to him? The Ottomans already dominated both sides of the Bosphorus. They held Asia Minor. They controlled most of the Balkans. Constantinople was just a stubborn holdout in the middle. But here's the thing, geography is destiny. Constantinople sat right between Europe and Asia, right on the strait where the Black Sea meets the Mediterranean. Whoever controlled it controlled trade, armies, and influence. It wasn't just about pride, it was about power. And yet pride was part of it too. Muslim leaders had dreamed of conquering Constantinople since the 7th century, when the first Arab armies laid siege to its walls. The Prophet Muhammad himself was said to have declared, "One day, Constantinople will be conquered. How wonderful will be the commander who conquers it, and how wonderful will be his army." Mehmet grew up hearing that prophecy. To him, it wasn't just strategy. It was destiny waiting for a name, and he wanted that name to be his. Ambition alone doesn't take cities. Mehmet knew he needed muscle. And so, in the years before the siege, he built up an army like none Constantinople had ever faced. Estimates put the Ottoman force at anywhere from 80,000 to 150,000 men, janissaries, cavalry, irregulars, siege engineers, sappers, sailors. Compare that to maybe 7,000 defenders inside the city, and you see how lopsided it was. But Mehmet didn't just rely on numbers. He innovated. His navy, for example, was expanded to hundreds of ships, from sleek galleys to heavy transports. He built fortresses along the Bosphorus to choke off Constantinople's lifelines. Most famously, he hired Urban the Hungarian to build those massive cannons capable of smashing even the strongest walls. Think about that, a 21-year-old investing in experimental superweapons. It's the kind of gamble you'd expect from a Silicon Valley startup founder today, betting everything on a radical new technology. And just like startups, it could have failed spectacularly or changed the game forever. For Mehmet, it did the latter. But let's not ignore the psychological side. Mehmet knew war wasn't only about steel and stone, It was about belief. He cast himself as the divinely chosen conqueror, spreading the word of the prophet's prophecy. To his men, this wasn't just another campaign. This was holy work. At the same time, he used fear brilliantly. Envoys carried messages to Constantinople offering generous terms if the city surrendered, implying mercy if they yielded, destruction if they resisted. The choice was designed to gnaw at them. Should they fight and risk annihilation, or submit and live in shame? This combination of religious destiny and psychological warfare was Mehmet's genius. He didn't just build armies, he built inevitability. Here's where things get almost tragic. The Byzantines knew Mehmet's ambition was coming for them. They begged for help from the West, Italy, France, the Pope, anyone. Some aid trickled in, a few hundred Genoese soldiers under Giovanni Giustiniani, a handful of Venetian ships. But nothing like the Crusades of old. Why? Because Europe was distracted. England and France were busy wrapping up the 100 Years' War. Spain was still fighting its Reconquista. The Pope was caught in politics. And some rulers thought, the Byzantines have held out this long. Surely they'll manage again. So while Mehmet's ambition grew, Constantinople's pleas mostly fell on deaf ears. Europe underestimated both the Sultan and the new age of warfare he represented. One thing you notice reading about Mehmet is his sheer confidence. Older rulers might hesitate, worrying about risks, diplomacy, logistics. Mehmet didn't hesitate. He believed utterly that history was waiting for him. There's something magnetic about that kind of confidence. It rallies men. It terrifies enemies. And sometimes, it creates the very destiny it seeks. Because when you act as though you cannot fail, you make others start to believe it too. We can't forget the symbolism. For Mehmet, Constantinople wasn't just a Christian city. It was the Roman capital. To conquer it meant not just ending Byzantium, but claiming Rome's mantle for himself. He would be Caesar, emperor of 2 continents, ruler of East and West. And when you think about it, he kind of was. After the fall, he adopted the title Kaiser Rom, Caesar of Rome. In his mind, the Ottoman Empire wasn't just replacing Byzantium, it was becoming Rome reborn, only under a new faith. That's the scale of his ambition. Not just land, not just power, but world history itself. So by the spring of 1453, here's what we had: a young, brilliant, dangerously ambitious sultan. An empire swelling with manpower and resources. A prophecy that gave his soldiers divine confidence. A city weakened, isolated, and still trusting in walls built before cannons existed. Put that all together, and the collision felt inevitable. Constantinople was on borrowed time, and Mehmet was the creditor knocking at the door. If the Theodosian walls symbolized the old world, Mehmet's ambition symbolized the new. One was stone, ancient, proud. The other was iron, gunpowder, restless. And when stone meets iron, history doesn't stay still. This wasn't just a battle for a city. It was a clash of ages, medieval faith against modern firepower, old Rome against new empire, tradition against ambition. And Mehmet knew, with the fervor of youth, that he was on the side of the future. Every great story needs a tragic hero, and for the fall of Constantinople, that figure was Constantine XI Palaiologos. He wasn't the most powerful emperor Byzantium had ever seen. He wasn't the most brilliant or the most celebrated. But he was the last. And sometimes, being the last in line can be heavier than all the glories that came before. Constantine was born into a dynasty that had long been fighting to keep Byzantium alive. By the time he inherited the throne in 1449, the empire was a husk of its former self, reduced to the city itself, a few fortresses, and a handful of outposts in Greece. But what he lacked in resources, he made up for in grit. Constantine XI understood the stakes. He was either going to hold the line against the Ottomans or preside over the death of an empire that had endured for more than 1,000 years. Becoming emperor in those circumstances wasn't an honor, it was a burden. Imagine sitting on a throne knowing that you were essentially captain of a sinking ship. Your treasury is empty, your allies are unreliable, your people are divided, and outside your walls is the most powerful war machine in the world. Yet Constantine didn't shy away. He wore the purple not with arrogance, but with a grim sense of duty. He wasn't naive. He knew Constantinople couldn't outlast the Ottomans forever. But if fate demanded that he be the final emperor, then he would go down fighting. It's worth noting how rare that mindset was. Many rulers in history, faced with overwhelming odds, chose exile, surrender, or compromise. Constantine could have slipped away to the Morea in Greece, joined his brothers, and preserved his life. But he didn't. He chose to stay in Constantinople. That choice alone says volumes about his character. Constantine XI saw himself as the last defender of both empire and faith. Byzantium wasn't just politics, it was Orthodox Christianity's beating heart. For him, surrendering the city to the Ottomans wasn't just losing a war, it was betraying the faith of his fathers. And yet, here's where the tragedy deepens. His own people were divided on this very point. Many Orthodox Byzantines despised the Catholic West. When Constantine tried to heal the Great Schism to secure aid from Rome, he sparked bitter debates. Some priests preached that they'd rather see the city fall to the Turks than bend to the Pope. Imagine trying to rally a city where your own clergy were split down the middle, some praying for angels and others denouncing your diplomacy as betrayal. Still, Constantine pushed ahead, knowing unity, even fragile, grudging unity, was their only hope. What makes Constantine XI fascinating is that he wasn't just a figurehead, he was a soldier. Before becoming emperor, he'd fought in Greece against both Turks and rival Christian lords. He was experienced in commanding troops, organizing defenses, and making hard decisions. During the siege, he didn't hide in palaces. Chroniclers describe him inspecting the walls, overseeing repairs after cannon fire, encouraging soldiers, even working side by side with common citizens. In those final weeks, he wasn't just the emperor, he was one more defender of a doomed city, carrying a sword instead of a scepter. That image, an emperor on the walls, not in the throne room, is what makes him so compelling. It's leadership by example, the kind that inspires loyalty even when hope is thin. But leadership couldn't erase the reality. Constantine was trapped in a cage. Every avenue of escape or salvation narrowed with each passing day. He looked west for aid, but Europe sent only a trickle of reinforcements. He looked east and saw nothing but Ottoman banners. Inside the city, food grew scarce, morale fragile. Every decision he made was a choice between bad and worse. Send men to repair one breach and another gap opened. Station soldiers in one district and another weakened. It's the kind of impossible position that makes you wonder, how do you carry that weight? How do you sleep, knowing you're making decisions not just for today, but for the survival or death of an empire that had lasted over a millennium? We often think of emperors in statuesque terms, cold, marble figures. But Constantine XI was flesh and blood. He knew fear. He felt despair. And yet he still carried on. There's a story that in the final days, he went to Hagia Sophia to pray, laying aside his crown and confessing his sins as any ordinary man might. It's such a human detail. Here was the Emperor of Rome, humbling himself, knowing his end was near. In that moment, he wasn't just a ruler, he was a man facing mortality with honesty. And there's something profoundly moving in that. Because while walls and armies might crumble, dignity in the face of doom is its own kind of victory. What Constantine XI gave Constantinople wasn't salvation, but defiance. He became the embodiment of resistance against impossible odds. His presence told the citizens, "We may not win, but we will not kneel." That spirit mattered. It gave people the courage to keep repairing walls, to keep fighting skirmishes, to keep hoping against hope that maybe, somehow, a miracle or an allied fleet would arrive. Without Constantine's example, the city might have surrendered earlier. With him, it held out to the bitter end. It's almost unbearable to think of what must have gone through his mind. He was the last emperor. He knew it. Every dawn might bring the end not just of his life, but of a civilization stretching back to Augustus. That kind of awareness could crush a man. But Constantine carried it with a strange dignity. And that's why, centuries later, his name still echoes. Not as the founder of a dynasty or the conqueror of lands, but as the man who stood when standing was all that was left. The legend says that in the final assault, Constantine XI tore off his imperial regalia, choosing to die as a soldier among his men rather than be recognized and captured as an emperor. Whether literally true or not, it captures the essence of who he was. He wasn't clinging to titles or crowns. He was clinging to honor. And that is why he remains one of history's great tragic figures, a man who inherited ashes, but still fought as if the world depended on him. Constantine Xi's story is a reminder that sometimes leadership isn't about winning. It's about how you carry yourself when you know you're going to lose. It's about dignity in the face of disaster, about standing for something even when it costs you everything. In a way, he represents the very spirit of Constantinople itself, weakened, cornered, betrayed by time, but still unbowed until the last breath. By the time the Ottomans encircled the city in 1453, Constantine XI had already accepted his role in history. He wasn't waiting for rescue anymore. He was preparing for sacrifice. The last emperor stood on the walls, the cannons thundered, and the stage was set for the final act of Byzantium. If you had wandered the streets of Constantinople in the spring of 1453, you might have thought you were walking through the ruins of two cities at once, one alive, trembling, waiting, and another long dead, a husk whose ghosts still lingered. That was the paradox of Constantinople on the eve of its fall. It was both inhabited and abandoned, both sacred and broken, both vibrant with last prayers and silent with decay. The chroniclers of the siege often describe the walls, the cannons, the battles. But to me, the most haunting image is the city itself, as it existed day to day for those who called it home. Streets where weeds grew through cracked stone. Churches with more dust than worshippers. Whole districts standing empty, their windows like hollow eyes. And in the midst of this, priests chanting, candles burning, the people clinging to rituals as if faith itself could hold back the armies of Mehmet. Constantinople had once been the queen of cities, the envy of the medieval world. Travelers marveled at its markets, its palaces, its gardens, its endless sprawl. But by the mid-1400s, much of that grandeur had collapsed inward. Entire quarters lay deserted, depopulated after centuries of wars, plagues, and economic decline. You could walk for blocks and see more ruins than homes. Houses collapsed into themselves, roofs caved in, walls ivy-clad. Some people scavenged wood and stone from these ruins to repair the city's defenses. Others used them as makeshift shelters. Dogs and even wolves prowled among the ruins at night. Imagine being a child in that city, growing up surrounded not by bustling life, but by crumbling echoes of greatness. Every step a reminder of what had been lost. And yet, people still clung to it. Because even in decay, Constantinople was holy ground. Religion hung heavy over the city. With so little left in material wealth or military power, people leaned harder on spiritual hope. Priests led processions through the streets, carrying icons of the Virgin Mary, chanting hymns, sprinkling holy water on the walls. Some claimed visions of angels patrolling the ramparts. Others preached prophecies that Constantinople would never fall, or that even if it did, salvation would come at the very last moment. It's easy to dismiss such beliefs now, knowing what history had in store. But when you're living in a city surrounded by enemies, with cannonballs crashing into your walls daily, those rituals mattered. They gave people something to cling to. A sense that they weren't just fighting Mehmet's army, they were part of a cosmic struggle, good against evil, light against darkness. And yet, not everyone agreed on what that faith meant. The great schism between Eastern Orthodoxy and Western Catholicism hadn't healed. And Constantine Xi's decision to reunite, at least formally, with Rome in exchange for promised aid stirred bitter resentment. Some Orthodox clergy thundered that this union was heresy. They claimed God would never allow his city to fall, unless it was punishment for mingling with Latin heretics. Others argued that without Western support, the empire was doomed anyway. So imagine the conversations in the streets. One priest calling for unity with Rome, another shouting that such unity was blasphemy. Families divided over whether to pray for the Pope or curse him. Inside a city already hollowed out, this division was like salt in the wound. And the Ottomans, watching from outside, surely knew that the defenders weren't just short on soldiers, they were short on solidarity. For ordinary citizens, survival was a balancing act between fear and faith. Food grew scarce as the siege dragged on. People relied on dwindling stores of grain, salted fish, whatever livestock could be kept inside the walls. Fires burned in courtyards where families boiled thin soups or baked coarse bread. Children played less or not at all. They learned to recognize the sound of cannon fire, to run to cellars when the walls shook. Women prayed more, sometimes sewing sandbags or carrying stones to patch breaches. The city lived on a kind of wartime rhythm, mornings filled with smoke from cannon strikes, afternoons spent repairing walls, evenings consumed with prayers and processions. And yet, amid the desperation, there was a strange dignity. People dressed in their best clothes for religious services. They sang hymns louder when the cannons boomed. They greeted neighbors with ritual blessings even as they secretly wondered if they'd both be alive by week's end. Another shadow haunted the city: suspicion. In times of crisis, paranoia thrives. Rumors spread that someone inside might open a gate to the Ottomans, that spies roamed the markets, that greedy merchants or desperate beggars could be bribed. Every shadow felt dangerous, every stranger suspect. That fear only deepened as Ottoman propaganda seeped through. Mehmet's envoys promised mercy if the city surrendered, whispered of wealth and safety for those who switched sides. Some Byzantines listened. Others spat at the idea. But everyone wondered, who among us might betray us? When you live in a city of ghosts, trust becomes as fragile as the walls themselves. If you try to imagine Constantinople in those days, think about sound. The deep thunder of cannons by day. The crack of stone against stone as walls shattered. The cries of priests chanting in Hagia Sophia. The tolling of bells calling men to arms or women to prayer. And at night, eerie silences broken by sudden alarms, raids on the walls, whispers of tunnels being dug beneath. That soundscape would have been constant, exhausting. Sleep was scarce. Every dawn felt like a reprieve, every dusk like the shadow of doom drawing closer. What makes this picture even more poignant is that despite everything, despite hunger, ruin, division, people clung fiercely to their identity. They still called themselves Romans Romaeoi, heirs of Caesar and Constantine. They still treated Hagia Sophia as the center of the world. They still believed that somehow, being who they were mattered, even if they were outnumbered 10-1. It's a kind of stubbornness that history often overlooks. We focus on battles and emperors, but ordinary people living in fear yet still singing hymns, still baking bread, still telling children stories of angels, that's its own kind of heroism. Because that's what Constantinople was in those final days. A city where ghosts of past glories haunted every street, and priests tried to keep the living anchored in hope. A place where faith and fear collided, where rituals tried to paper over despair, where ruins and relics stood side by side. When we talk about the fall of Constantinople, it's tempting to imagine only the grand spectacle: cannons, sultans, emperors. But the truth is, inside the walls, it was also about widows boiling their last beans, priests blessing broken stones, children tracing crosses on doorways, and men sharpening swords they knew they might not live to use. So by the time Mehmet's armies fully encircled the city, Constantinople was already a place of contradictions, proud yet weakened, faithful yet divided, alive yet half dead. A city of ghosts, haunted by its own past. A city of priests clinging to faith even as doom loomed. That was the world Constantine XI had to defend. Not just walls and soldiers, but the spirit of a city that refused to admit it was dying, even as death stood at its gates. If there was one thing thicker than the smoke of cannon fire over Constantinople in 1453, it was the atmosphere of religion. The city had always seen itself as holy, a chosen place, guarded by God, the Virgin Mary, and the saints. But during the final siege, faith became both a source of strength and a deep fracture line. Fear and faith walked hand in hand through those streets. Some saw visions of angels ready to descend and save them. Others whispered that the empire's sins had finally caught up with it, and that God himself had abandoned Constantinople. People argued in churches, on street corners, even on the walls while holding spears. Were they about to witness another miracle, or the end of the world? That uncertainty gnawed at them as much as hunger or cannon fire. At the heart of it all was the Church. For centuries, the split between Orthodox and Catholic had festered like an old wound. And now, with the city under siege, Emperor Constantine XI had done something controversial. He agreed to recognize the authority of the Pope in exchange for Western aid. It was a desperate gamble. Without Western help, Constantinople stood little chance. But to many Orthodox citizens, this union of the churches felt like betrayal. Priests thundered from pulpits that bowing to the Pope was worse than bowing to the Sultan. Some even preached the infamous line, "Better the turban of the Turk than the tiara of the Pope." That phrase summed up the mood of a large part of the population. They would rather submit to Islam and keep their Orthodox faith than accept Catholic heresy in their own churches. For Constantine XI, this was devastating. He needed unity. Instead, he got bitterness. The scene inside Hagia Sophia captures the tension perfectly. This cathedral had been the spiritual heart of Byzantium for nearly 1,000 years. During the siege, it became a place of ceaseless prayer. Candles burned day and night. Priests led processions. Families gathered to beg for divine mercy. But at the same time, the debates raged right under its dome. Some clergy performed Latin rite ceremonies for the small number of Catholic allies inside the city. Others denounced those ceremonies as blasphemous. Imagine standing in what was supposed to be the holiest, most unifying place in the city and hearing not harmony but discord. The very building meant to symbolize God's presence instead became an echo chamber of human division. And then there were the prophecies. Constantinople had long been the subject of apocalyptic predictions. One prophecy claimed that the city would fall, but only after being abandoned by angels who had guarded it since Constantine the Great. Another promised that if the city did fall, the Turks would be driven out within 3 days by divine intervention. Still another whispered that a marble emperor would rise again at the last moment, leading Byzantium to salvation. These prophecies circulated like wildfire. For some, they were a source of courage. God will save us. For others, they sowed confusion. If we're destined to fall, why fight? The line between hope and despair blurred until it was hard to tell which was which. Caught in the middle of this storm was Constantine XI. He needed the city's faith to hold, but he also needed its factions to unite. He attended Catholic ceremonies to honor the union, but he also knelt in Orthodox rites. He tried to be emperor of both, though in truth he satisfied neither side completely. His position was almost impossible: defend the city with too few soldiers, lean on allies mistrusted by his own people, and hold together a spiritual community that was tearing itself apart in the face of annihilation. That he managed to keep the city from fracturing entirely is a testament to his stubbornness and quiet charisma. For ordinary citizens, fear wasn't just about death. It was about judgment. Many believed the fall of Constantinople would mean not only the end of their lives, but the end of their place in God's plan. They asked, were we abandoned because of our sins? Was this punishment for pride, greed, heresy? Did the union doom us, or was it our refusal to embrace it that sealed our fate? That kind of spiritual anxiety is crushing. It meant every cannonball wasn't just an enemy weapon, it was a possible sign of divine wrath. Yet, even as fear spread, rituals continued. Priests carried icons along the walls. Processions marched by torchlight. Bells rang to call people to prayer each time the city trembled. Some defenders swore they saw visions of the Virgin Mary walking the ramparts at night, cloaked in light, reassuring them that they were not alone. Were these visions real? Hallucinations born of exhaustion? Desperate hopes shaped into sight? We can't know. But what matters is that they felt real. And in times of crisis, what people believe can matter as much as what is. It's also worth remembering that the Ottomans had their own spiritual narrative. For Mehmet II and his soldiers, this wasn't just conquest. It was jihad, the fulfillment of prophecy. They believed God had destined them to take Constantinople. They prayed in their own camps, listened to their own preachers promise paradise for martyrs, and chanted verses from the Quran before battle. So outside the walls, one faith promised victory. Inside the walls, another faith promised deliverance. Two theologies clashed as much as two armies. And in that collision, Fear grew sharper, because what if the enemy's god seemed stronger? Perhaps the cruelest part of the story is that, for many Byzantines, their faith didn't fail in the way they expected. They weren't betrayed by angels leaving them, but by men. No Great Western Crusade arrived. No miracle storm destroyed the Ottoman fleet. No heavenly army descended. Instead, the miracle people prayed for never came. And when the walls finally broke, the shock wasn't just physical. It was spiritual. The last sight of Hagia Sophia as a Christian church wasn't a triumphant prophecy fulfilled, but thousands of terrified people huddled inside, priests chanting one final liturgy before Ottoman soldiers crashed through the doors. Faith and fear collided, and fear won. The fall of Constantinople wasn't just a military event, it was a spiritual earthquake. For Byzantines, it felt like the end of a divine promise. For Western Europe, it was a jolt that stirred fears of a rising Ottoman tide. And for Mehmet too, it was confirmation that prophecy was on his side. Inside those walls, faith gave people courage, but it also divided them, confused them, and sometimes blinded them to the hard realities of politics and war. Fear sharpened their prayers, but also hollowed their hope. Together, faith and fear defined the last days of Constantinople more than food, weapons, or even walls. By the time Mehmet ordered his cannons to roar and his navy to close the Golden Horn, Constantinople wasn't just fighting for survival. It was fighting for its soul. And that, more than anything, is why the story of its fall still feels so human. A city caught between believing in miracles and staring down doom, between chanting prayers and hearing the thunder of artillery. Faith gave them courage. Fear reminded them of reality. And in the space between those two forces, Byzantium took its final stand. When you picture Constantinople in 1453, you might imagine only Byzantines and Ottomans locked in their final struggle. But the truth is far messier. The city was a crossroads not just of faith and geography, but of interests, and some of the strangest, most complicated players in its last chapter were the Venetians and Genoese. They weren't there out of pure loyalty. These were merchant republics, with ships to sail, trade routes to protect, and profits to chase. They were rivals with each other, often bitterly so, but they both had outposts in and around Constantinople. And when Mehmet II's cannons began pounding the walls, these Italians found themselves dragged into a drama far bigger than trade agreements. The Venetians and Genoese had long been entwined with Byzantine fortunes. They had merchant colonies inside the city, their own districts with warehouses, docks, and churches. For centuries, they'd negotiated with emperors for trading rights, sometimes helping defend the empire, sometimes bleeding it dry with mercantile demands. By 1453, their position was awkward. On one hand, Constantinople was a key hub for their trade with the Black Sea and beyond. Losing it to the Ottomans threatened their economic interests. On the other hand, both Venice and Genoa also did business with the Ottomans. Sometimes profitable business. So their loyalty wasn't simple. It wasn't, "We're here to save Byzantium." It was, "How do we protect our ships, our colonies, our profit, and maybe our souls?" The most famous Italian in the siege was Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, a Genoese mercenary captain. He arrived with about 700 well-armed men, some of the best soldiers the city had seen in years. For a population starving for reinforcements, it must have felt like angels landing on the docks. Giustiniani was tough, experienced, and utterly professional. He wasn't there for faith alone. He had contracts and promises of reward. But once he took charge of defending key sections of the Theodosian walls, he became indispensable. Chroniclers credit him with organizing effective countermeasures against the Ottomans' first assaults. He directed men with discipline, shored up morale, and gave Constantine XI something Byzantium hadn't had in years, a commander who knew how to fight modern sieges. If there was a brief moment when people inside the city thought maybe, just maybe, they could hold out, Giustiniani was at the heart of that hope. Venice, meanwhile, played its own complicated game. Some Venetian ships did join the defense. A few captains committed themselves and their crews to fighting alongside the Byzantines. But the Venetian Senate back home hesitated. Officially, Venice didn't declare an all-out crusade to save Constantinople. Why? because Venice had lucrative trade treaties with the Ottomans, and risking them was bad business. So while Venetian sailors fought and died on the walls, their government weighed contracts, profits, and diplomacy. It's a cold reminder that, even in moments of supposed unity, politics and money often speak louder than faith. And then there was the rivalry. Venetians and Genoese had hated each other for centuries, their wars turning the Mediterranean into a chessboard of blood and gold. Even inside Constantinople, their quarters were separated, and skirmishes between them weren't unheard of. But in 1453, they had to stand side by side against a common enemy. It must have felt bizarre, men who had fought each other at sea now patrolling the same ramparts, glaring but cooperating because survival left no choice. Unity born of desperation, fragile as the crumbling walls themselves. The Italians weren't just important on land. They played a huge role at sea. When a small Christian fleet managed to break through the Ottoman blockade and reach Constantinople with supplies, it was thanks to Venetian and Genoese seamanship. One of the most dramatic moments came when a handful of Christian ships fought their way past Mehmet's navy to deliver grain and reinforcements. Imagine the cheers from the walls as people watched sails crest the horizon, cannon fire exploding on the water, ships forcing their way into the Golden Horn. For a starving, besieged city, it must have felt like a miracle. But it was only a temporary reprieve. The Ottomans soon adapted, dragging ships overland to bypass the city's great defensive chain and trap the harbor. Even the Italians couldn't stop the tightening noose. It wasn't all harmony, even in the face of death. Some Byzantines distrusted the Italians, fearing they might switch sides if Mehmet offered them better terms. After all, both Venice and Genoa had signed treaties with the Ottomans in the past. That suspicion worked both ways. The Italians worried the Byzantines might blame them if the city fell, or even scapegoat them as traitors. In the chaos of siege warfare, paranoia breeds easily. And in Constantinople, it was everywhere. The tragedy of Giovanni Giustiniani reflects the fragile role of these foreign allies. During the final Ottoman assault on May 29th, Giustiniani was gravely wounded, some sources say by a cannon fragment, others by an arrow. He was carried from the walls, bleeding and unable to command. The sight of their strongest leader leaving the battlefield crushed the defenders' morale. Some even said the city fell the moment he was carried away. Whether fair or not, his injury became a symbol. Without him, the fragile hope of holding out collapsed. Giustiniani himself didn't live long after. He was taken by ship to Chios, where he died of his wounds. For Byzantium, his loss was more than a personal tragedy. It was the final unraveling of the threadbare fabric holding the defense together. So how should we see the Venetians and Genoese? Were they opportunists, protecting their trade while Byzantium bled? Or were they saviors, bringing the only real reinforcements the city received? The truth lies somewhere in between. They were men of their age, pragmatic, profit-driven, yet still capable of bravery and sacrifice. They fought hard, but they also kept an eye on their ledgers. They bled for Constantinople, but not out of pure devotion. And that duality, self-interest mixed with courage, makes them some of the most human figures in the story. Without the Venetians and Genoese, Constantinople might have fallen even faster. Their ships brought supplies. Their mercenaries stiffened the defense. Their presence bought the city precious weeks. But in the end, they couldn't alter the outcome. And that's the haunting part. They were wild cards, yes, but even wild cards can't change a game when the deck is stacked so heavily on the other side. As the siege wore on, the Italians remained critical but increasingly desperate players. Giustiniani's leadership held the walls together until it didn't. Venetian ships fought the Ottoman fleet, but the blockade grew tighter. And through it all, Byzantines and Italians alike prayed, fought, and died, side by side, but never entirely united. The wild cards had been played. And as the cannons thundered louder and the walls began to crack, even the bravest mercenaries couldn't keep history from turning its page. For 1,000 years, Constantinople's Theodosian walls had stood like an ironclad promise. No army could take them. They had beaten back Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, even Crusaders. But in 1453, something new rolled into the fields outside the city, something the old walls had never faced before. A cannon so massive, so unprecedented, that it became a character in the story all by itself. This was the gun built by Urban, a Hungarian engineer who had once offered his services to the Byzantines. They couldn't afford him. Mehmet II could, and more importantly, Mehmet could imagine what no other ruler had dared, using colossal artillery not just to harass a city, but to tear down the very walls that had kept empires safe for centuries. Urban's story is fascinating. He was a skilled metalworker, an inventor obsessed with pushing the limits of gunpowder technology. The Byzantines had politely listened to his ideas, but dismissed them as impractical, too expensive, too risky, too experimental. But Mehmet wasn't the kind of ruler who said, too risky. He saw potential where others saw madness. He gave Urban the resources he needed: foundries, craftsmen, and a sultan's treasury. What emerged was something the world had never seen: a bombard so massive it required 60 oxen and hundreds of men just to drag it across the countryside. The barrel was over 25 feet long, capable of hurling stone balls weighing more than half a ton. Imagine the shock of seeing one of those projectiles loaded, carved from solid rock, round as a moon, lifted by cranes and slung into the maw of this iron beast. When it fired, the ground shook. Chroniclers said the sound could be heard miles away. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a statement. When the bombard opened fire on the Theodosian walls in April 1453, it was like nothing the defenders had ever experienced. Catapults and trebuchets they understood loud, yes, but survivable. A cannon of this scale was a new nightmare. Stone shattered under its blows. Entire sections of the wall trembled. Dust clouds rose so thick that men choked on them. Even when defenders rushed to repair the damage by night, plugging holes with earth, barrels, and rubble, the knowledge sank in: the walls could be broken. And that realization was more devastating than the physical damage. The myth of invincibility cracked. There was a grim rhythm to it. The cannon could only be fired a handful of times a day, it needed hours to cool, and the loading process was painstaking. But each time it thundered, everyone in Constantinople froze. Bells tolled warnings, families prayed, soldiers scrambled to the breach. And when the stone ball smashed into the walls, men were often buried alive under rubble, their bodies mangled in ways medieval medicine couldn't imagine. Even when no one died directly, the psychological toll was immense. Imagine trying to sleep at night, knowing that come dawn, the cannon would roar again, smashing another piece of the city's soul. The defenders showed astonishing resilience. Each night, they hauled rubble, timber, and earth to fill the breaches. Women carried baskets of dirt. Children fetched stones. Priests blessed the workers as they labored by torchlight. But it was a losing battle. The cannonballs were too heavy, the impacts too violent. The patched walls lacked the strength of the original stonework. With every day, Constantinople bled out another measure of its strength. In a way, Urban's cannon was more than a weapon, it was a symbol of the age turning. Constantinople represented the old world, defended by walls built in the 5th century. Mehmet's bombard represented the new, an era where gunpowder ruled, where ancient fortifications crumbled before iron and fire. This wasn't just the fall of a city. It was the fall of an era. After 1453, every castle in Europe looked less secure. Every ruler realized that no stone wall, however thick, could ignore the reality of cannon fire. The age of knights and fortresses was giving way to the age of artillery and centralized states. Constantinople was just the first to learn the lesson. Let's pause to appreciate the sheer scale of this gun. Some accounts suggest its stone projectiles were the size of small boulders you'd find in a riverbed. When they struck the walls, they didn't just dent them, they punched craters big enough for men to climb through. Chroniclers say the recoil drove the cannon backward into the ground, requiring hours to reposition. Sometimes it even cracked under its own stress, killing crew members. But none of that mattered, because the terror it inspired was worth more than its accuracy. For defenders on the wall, each shot was like watching a mountain collapse in slow motion. For attackers, Each boom was a drumbeat of inevitability. It's important to note, the cannon alone didn't win the siege. Mehmet used it as part of a larger strategy. He placed multiple smaller bombards along the line, coordinating their fire to keep defenders stretched thin. He used naval pressure, tunneling attempts, and constant probing attacks to wear the city down. But the super cannon became the centerpiece, the psychological hammer. Every time it roared, it reminded Constantinople that no miracle of stone would save them this time. What did people inside think? Some chroniclers say they believed the cannon was a demonic weapon, powered by sorcery. Others argued it was God's punishment, proof that human pride in walls and stone was worthless against divine will. For the emperor and his commanders, it was a tactical nightmare. How do you defend against something that erases 100 feet of wall with one shot? You can't. You just patch, pray, and fight on. News of the cannon spread quickly beyond Constantinople. Even in the moment, Europeans realized something had shifted. Letters from survivors describe it in tones of awe and terror, as if they had witnessed the future crashing down on the present. Urban's name became infamous, though his fate was grim. Some say he died when one of his cannons exploded. His invention had outlived him, shaping warfare for centuries to come. Constantinople didn't fall solely because of Urban's cannon. But without it, the city might have lasted months longer, perhaps long enough for European reinforcements to arrive. The cannon didn't just knock down walls. It collapsed the timeline, accelerating the fall. And symbolically, it did even more. It shattered the illusion that Constantinople was untouchable, that Rome's shadow still had divine protection. When the cannonballs smashed into the walls, they also smashed into 1,000 years of faith in stone and tradition. By May of 1453, the cannon had done its work. The walls were cracked, the defenders exhausted, the myth destroyed. Constantinople was no longer the invincible city, it was a besieged ruin waiting for the final blow. Urban's creation had lived up to its terrible promise. It was indeed the cannon that changed everything, not just for Byzantium, but for the world. If the cannon was the hammer, the army that Mehmet II brought to Constantinople was the anvil. Together, they created a crushing inevitability. To stand on the walls of Constantinople and look out at the Ottoman host must have been like staring at the tide itself, endless, rolling, impossible to stop. It wasn't just numbers, though numbers mattered. It was the organization, the discipline, the mixture of peoples, the sheer machinery of conquest that made the Ottoman army so terrifying in 1453. This was no ragged horde. This was a war machine, modern, professional, and relentless. Let's start with size. Estimates vary wildly. Some chroniclers say 80,000, others claim 150,000. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but whatever the exact number, it was massive compared to the 7,000 or so defenders inside Constantinople. That's not a fight, that's a tidal wave against a sandcastle. And it wasn't just soldiers. The Ottoman host included engineers, sappers, cooks, blacksmiths, water carriers, even scribes. An entire mobile society moved with the army, making it self-sufficient. That's the key to understanding it. This wasn't just a force for battle, it was an engine of war that could camp, build, repair, and sustain itself for months. At the heart of this machine were the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry. These weren't conscripts or mercenaries. They were a standing army, raised from childhood through the Devshirme system, where Christian boys were taken from their families in the Balkans, converted to Islam, and trained as soldiers loyal only to the Sultan. The Janissaries were disciplined to a degree that shocked Europeans. They drilled constantly. They obeyed orders without hesitation. They fought with bows, pikes, swords, and increasingly, firearms. In an age when most armies were feudal levies, knights summoned by lords, peasants pressed into service, the Janissaries were something new, a professional corps. To face them on the battlefield was to face precision, not chaos. And when Mehmet ordered the final assault on Constantinople, it was the Janissaries who delivered the killing blow. But the Ottomans weren't just infantry. Their cavalry, especially the Sipahis, the feudal horsemen granted land in exchange for service, were a sight to behold. Armored, fast, deadly with bows and lances, They were the hammer that could crush retreating foes. Imagine looking out from the walls and seeing thousands of horsemen sweeping the plains, banners fluttering, hoofs thundering. Even if they weren't the decisive factor in a siege, their presence added to the sense of overwhelming force. The defenders knew that if they ever tried to sally out in the open, the cavalry would annihilate them. Urban's supercannon was the star, but the Ottomans didn't rely on just one gun. Mehmed assembled dozens of smaller bombards, mortars, and siege guns. He had teams of engineers to position them, repair them, and coordinate their fire. This was artillery not as novelty but as system. And behind the gunners came the sappers, men who tunneled under the walls, trying to collapse them from below. Others built wooden towers, ladders, and bridges. The Ottomans used every technique in the siege playbook, old and new, in relentless combination. One of Mehmed's smartest moves was to bring a fleet. Constantinople was famously hard to encircle because of its position on the water. But Mehmed launched hundreds of ships into the Bosphorus and the Sea of Marmara, galleys, transports, smaller craft, creating a blockade that cut the city off from resupply. The most dramatic moment came when he had ships dragged overland on greased logs to bypass the great chain that guarded the Golden Horn. It was a feat of audacity and engineering, stunning the defenders. One morning they looked out and saw Ottoman ships where none should be. The blockade was now total. For the Byzantines, that was devastating. No food, no reinforcements, no escape. Another striking feature of the Ottoman army was its diversity. This wasn't just Turks. Mehmed's forces included Arabs, Persians, Kurds, Serbs, Bulgarians, Albanians, and others. Some fought willingly, others as vassals or subjects, but together they created an empire's worth of manpower. From the walls, defenders would have heard a babble of languages, seen a patchwork of banners, smelled cooking fires with spices from distant lands. It must have felt like the whole world had come to crush them. And in a way, it had. Inside the walls, defenders were brave but few. They fought with desperation, patching gaps with whatever they had. But outside, the Ottoman machine was methodical, patient, tireless. That contrast mattered. Desperation can inspire heroics, but discipline wins wars. The Ottomans rotated units, rested men, kept supply lines flowing. Byzantines had no such luxury. Their warriors fought until exhaustion broke them. And towering over it all was Mehmed himself. Unlike many rulers who stayed behind the lines, he personally oversaw the siege. He rode along the front, inspected artillery, gave orders. His presence kept morale high. Soldiers believed they weren't just serving an empire, they were serving a sultan chosen by destiny. Mehmed combined ruthlessness with vision. When tunnels failed, he ordered more. When attacks faltered, he demanded new ones. When the fleet couldn't pass the chain, he invented a way around it. He was relentless, and so his army was relentless. For the defenders, looking out at this war machine must have been crushing. Every day, the Ottomans looked as strong as the day before, if not stronger. New trenches appeared, new batteries of guns, new ships in the water. And every day, Constantinople grew weaker. Stores of grain dwindled. Casualties mounted. Walls grew thinner. It must have felt like trying to hold back an ocean with bare hands. The Ottoman war machine worked because it blended old and new. Cavalry charges and siege towers, medieval tactics, were used alongside cannons and professional infantry, modern tactics. No single element was enough to crack Constantinople, but together, they created a pressure the city couldn't withstand. It was synergy before the word existed. An empire's resources, a young sultan's ambition, an army's discipline, all converging on one city. When historians say 1453 marks the end of the Middle Ages, this army is part of why. It represented a new model of warfare, centralized, professional, combined arms. Not knights and feudal levies, but standing troops, artillery, fleets, the kind of force that would dominate the modern era. And Constantinople, once the mightiest fortress in the world, became the proving ground for that new reality. By May, the war machine had done its work. The walls were cracked. The city was starving. The fleet had sealed the harbor. And Mehmed, surveying it all, knew the moment was near. Constantinople wasn't just besieged. It was suffocating, crushed beneath the weight of an empire in motion. The Ottoman war machine had surrounded it, outlasted it, and was now ready to devour it whole. The siege of Constantinople didn't arrive like a sudden storm. It crept, it settled, and then it clamped down like an iron fist. When Mehmet II's army finally encircled the city in April of 1453, there was no mistaking it. Constantinople was alone, cut off, and trapped. From that moment forward, life inside the walls turned into a rhythm of bombardment and repair, fear and prayer, hunger and exhaustion. Siege warfare was never glamorous. It was long, grinding, and cruel. For the people of Constantinople, it meant every day was a test of endurance, and every night was a rehearsal for the end. At first, there may have been a flicker of hope. Perhaps the Ottomans would hesitate, perhaps diplomacy might buy time. But when the great host spread out across the plain, when trenches were dug, when artillery was rolled into position, the reality sank in. The Ottomans weren't here to threaten. They were here to take. The city was surrounded on land by rows of tents, banners, and siege lines stretching as far as the eye could see. On the water, the Ottoman fleet formed a blockade, hemming in the Golden Horn and the Bosphorus. For the first time in centuries, Constantinople was fully sealed. No trade, no reinforcements, no escape. The defenders knew what that meant. A siege wasn't about dramatic battles every day. It was about starvation, attrition, waiting for walls to crack and spirits to crumble. And then came the sound that would define the weeks ahead, the thunder of Urban's bombard. The first time it fired, chroniclers say the earth itself shook. The stone ball smashed into the Theodosian walls with a force that seemed impossible. Dust filled the air. Men screamed. Bells rang alarms. And then silence as everyone stared at the crater torn into the wall that had stood for 1,000 years. From that moment on, the people of Constantinople lived by the rhythm of artillery. By day, the cannons tore holes. By night, citizens worked desperately to fill them. It was like trying to plug a dam with bare hands while water poured through. The work was exhausting, endless, and demoralizing. But the siege wasn't just artillery. Mehmet ordered regular probes and assaults, testing the defenses, keeping the defenders on edge. Small groups of Ottoman soldiers tried scaling ladders under cover of night. Others tunneled beneath the walls, only to be met with countermines dug by the Byzantines. There were raids, ambushes, sudden clashes at gates. Each one cost lives. For defenders, it meant no rest. Even when the cannons fell silent, men stood watch, eyes straining in the dark, ears tuned to the sound of shovels underground. Sleep was rare. Nerves frayed. A city under siege was a city that forgot what peace sounded like. Food became a weapon long before swords did. With the blockade in place, supplies dwindled. What grain remained was rationed. Fish from the harbor fed some, but not enough. Families stretched meals thinner and thinner. Bread grew coarse, bitter with fillers. Children's bellies shrank. The irony was painful. A city once famed for markets bursting with goods from 3 continents now scraped by on crumbs. Hunger gnawed as surely as the cannonballs. And through it all, faith became routine. Processions wound through the streets daily, icons raised high, priests chanting hymns. Every breach patched on the walls was blessed with holy water. Every night, candles burned in Hagia Sophia as people prayed for deliverance. But as the weeks dragged on, faith wavered. Some still believed in miracles, pointing to prophecies of divine rescue. Others began to doubt. Was God punishing them? Was the city abandoned? Faith gave hope, but it also deepened despair, because every unanswered prayer was another crack in the soul. The contrast between besiegers and besieged was stark. Inside Constantinople, exhaustion, hunger, dwindling numbers. Repairs by torchlight, soldiers half asleep at their posts, priests urging courage. Outside, the Ottoman war machine, organized and fresh, rotating soldiers, supplies flowing in, cannons thundering. Their camps buzzed with energy and purpose. To look out from the walls and see that must have been soul-crushing, an enemy that seemed tireless while you wasted away. There were attempts at negotiation. Envoys went back and forth. Mehmet offered terms: surrender peacefully, and lives would be spared. Resist and face slaughter. Emperor Constantine XI refused. To yield without a fight would be to betray the legacy of Byzantium. Better to die a Roman than live as a subject. His defiance inspired many, but it also sealed the city's fate. Diplomacy was dead. The siege would end only one way, in fire and blood. Week by week, the toll mounted. Men fell in skirmishes. Women buried husbands and sons. Children grew pale and weak. Each day without relief made it harder to hope. And yet, they endured. Every morning, the walls still had defenders. Every night, torches still lit the ramparts. Constantinople may have been crumbling, but it refused to collapse. That resilience frustrated Mehmet, but it also made his army more determined. The longer the city held, the more glory awaited its conqueror. What's chilling is how normal siege life became. People got used to cannon fire, like thunder in the background. They got used to working through the night, to hunger, to fear. Children played in alleys even as walls shook. Couples still married. Priests still baptized. Life shrank, but it went on. That's the strange thing about war. Even in the middle of catastrophe, people cling to routine. It's a way of saying we are still human. We are still alive. But beneath the surface, the city was unraveling. Supplies thinned. Morale frayed. The walls grew weaker. Mehmet's war machine pressed closer each day. The siege wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was a slow suffocation, a grinding down of strength and will. And everyone inside knew that unless a miracle came, they were watching their world die by inches. By the end of the first month, Constantinople was transformed. The proud city was now a battlefield, its streets filled with rubble, its people exhausted shadows, its walls scarred and trembling. The siege had begun not with a single blow, but with the steady, relentless tightening of a noose. And as the days dragged on, everyone knew this was only the beginning. The storm was still gathering, and the final strike was yet to come. If the Theodosian walls were Constantinople's shield on land, the Golden Horn was its shield at sea. This long, sheltered harbor curved like a scythe into the city, protecting its northern flank. For centuries, enemies who might have tried to attack from the water were stopped cold by one brilliant piece of engineering: a chain. Not just any chain, mind you. This was a colossal barrier, links as thick as a man's body, stretching across the mouth of the Golden Horn. Anchored to towers and winches on either side, it could be raised or lowered, but when drawn tight, it was impenetrable. No ship could break through without being torn apart. It was one of Constantinople's proudest defenses, and for a millennium it had done its job. In 1453, the Byzantines once again trusted that chain to keep them safe from the Ottoman fleet. And at first, it worked. Mehmet's galleys prowled outside the harbor, but the chain kept them at bay. The defenders breathed easier, knowing that at least one side of the city was secure. But Mehmet, too, was not a man easily denied. The chain itself deserves a moment of awe. Historians believe it was made of hundreds of massive iron links, each weighing as much as several men. Imagine the effort to haul it across the mouth of a harbor, to keep it taut against currents, storms, and the strain of enemy rams. Yet it had endured since the 7th century, surviving sieges by Arabs, Rus, and even Crusaders. For defenders, it wasn't just iron. It was history, proof that Constantinople was protected not only by stone but by ingenuity. When the siege began, men gathered at the water's edge to watch the chain lifted into place. It must have felt like a ritual, a declaration. Here, the sea itself obeys us. Here, the Ottomans will break. But they underestimated their enemy. From the Ottoman side, the chain was infuriating. Mehmet's fleet, hundreds of ships strong, sat idle outside, unable to touch the city's northern walls. Each day that passed, Constantinople's defenders jeered at them from the ramparts, taunting the invincible sultan whose navy could not even cross a stretch of water. For a man as proud and ambitious as Mehmet, that was intolerable. He hadn't dragged an empire into the siege to be mocked by an old iron chain. So he did what he always did when confronted with the impossible. He found a way around it. It sounds absurd even now. Mehmet ordered ships to be hauled out of the water, dragged across land, and relaunched inside the Golden Horn. Think about that for a moment. Moving a fleet not over sea, but over soil and hills. It was the kind of idea most commanders would laugh off as madness. But Mehmet didn't laugh. He planned. Wooden tracks were built. Logs were greased with animal fat. Ropes and pulleys were prepared. Soldiers and oxen were marshaled. And in one of the most astonishing feats of logistics in medieval warfare, Ottoman ships began to slide across the hills of Galata, creaking and groaning like beasts torn from their element. Chroniclers say it happened in a single night. Constantinople went to sleep with the chains still holding strong. And when dawn came, the defenders looked out and their hearts stopped. Ottoman ships floated inside the Golden Horn. It must have felt like sorcery. The one defense they had trusted most, the one barrier they had thought unbreakable, had been outflanked not by brute force, but by ingenuity. The chains still held, but it no longer mattered. The enemy had simply walked around it. The psychological blow was devastating. For weeks, defenders had told themselves, at least the harbor is safe. Now, that illusion shattered. Panic spread. Citizens ran to the walls overlooking the Golden Horn, staring in disbelief at the sails bobbing in waters that should have been untouchable. Suddenly, the city had to defend not just its land walls, but its sea walls too, thinner, weaker, less prepared. Resources were stretched even further. The noose tightened. Historians still marvel at Mehmet's maneuver. Was it genius? Absolutely. But it was also a gamble. Ships could have broken apart on the hills. The effort could have failed in mud or rock. But Mehmet's willingness to risk absurdity, to try what no one else would, is part of what made him unstoppable. He understood something crucial. Siege warfare isn't only about weapons. It's about imagination, about breaking the enemy's expectations. The chain was supposed to be eternal. By bypassing it, he didn't just move ships, he shattered the defenders' confidence in their own traditions. The Italian sailors inside the city must have been stunned. They knew naval warfare. They knew how much effort it took to launch and maneuver even a handful of galleys. To see an entire squadron dragged over hills, that was something else entirely. Some cursed Venetian hesitation back home, blaming their Senate for failing to send more ships when they had the chance. Others gritted their teeth and prepared for naval skirmishes in the Horn itself, now hopelessly outnumbered. For them, the chain had been the last great equalizer. With it nullified, their seamanship was suddenly irrelevant. The episode of the chain shows why Mehmet triumphed where so many before him failed. He adapted. When walls held, he built bigger cannons. When tunnels collapsed, he dug more. When chains blocked the sea, he carried ships over land. Against a foe like that, sheer courage wasn't enough. Constantinople's defenders could fight bravely, but they couldn't innovate fast enough to match him. As for the Great Chain itself, it remained stretched across the harbor until the very end. But once the city fell, it was dismantled. Some say its links were melted down for Ottoman weapons. Others say pieces of it survive in museums today. Either way, its legacy ended not in glory but in irrelevance. For centuries, it had been a symbol of Constantinople's defiance. In 1453, it became a symbol of how even the strongest traditions can be outwitted by imagination. The story of the Golden Horn chain isn't just a colorful anecdote. It's a turning point. It shows us how Constantinople's defenses, once thought invincible, were systematically stripped away. First, the walls cracked under cannon fire. Then the harbor chain was bypassed. Step by step, Mehmet dismantled the myths that had kept the city safe. And it also reminds us of a deeper truth. Wars are won not just by strength, but by creativity. The Ottomans didn't smash the chain. They thought around it. And in doing so, they turned Constantinople's pride into its vulnerability. By late April, the defenders were exhausted, the walls scarred, the harbor compromised. What had begun as confidence was dissolving into dread. The chain that once sang of safety now mocked them with its futility. And with Ottoman ships now anchored inside the Golden Horn, the city's defenders braced themselves for the next phase of the siege, a fight on all sides, with no illusion of safety left. When we talk about the siege of Constantinople, It's easy to get lost in the cannons, the sultans, the emperors, and the battles. But the heart of the story lies with the people trapped inside those walls, the men, women, and children who endured the daily reality of a city under siege. Constantinople in 1453 was no longer the bustling metropolis of old. Its population had dwindled to perhaps 50,000, maybe even less. That's smaller than many modern suburbs. And within those ancient walls, life during the siege took on a strange, claustrophobic rhythm. Hunger gnawed, hope flickered, fear thickened, and yet daily routines persisted. People still prayed, worked, argued, and loved, all while the thunder of cannon fire shook the ground beneath them. Food defined daily life. With the Ottoman blockade choking the city, supplies quickly ran thin. What little grain remained was rationed carefully. Bread was baked with fillers, bran, weeds, sometimes even ground up nutshells to stretch it further. Fish from the Golden Horn helped, but not enough for everyone. Families cut portions smaller and smaller. Children went to bed hungry, bellies aching. Some scavenged grass and roots from abandoned gardens inside the walls. Livestock was slaughtered early, salt meat stored as long as possible, but by mid-siege, even that grew scarce. Hunger sharpened tempers. Neighbors argued over scraps. Bakers were accused of hoarding flour. Rumors swirled of theft from storerooms. The siege wasn't just fought at the walls, it was fought at the dinner table, every bite a reminder of scarcity. Every night, when the cannons fell silent, the city came alive with work. Men hauled rubble, timber, and barrels to repair breaches in the walls. Women carried baskets of earth, stones, even furniture to stuff into gaps. Children fetched water, fetched tools, fetched whatever could be carried. It was exhausting labor. Torches flickered on the ramparts as silhouettes bent and lifted, sweat mixing with dust. Priests walked among them, blessing the repairs, urging courage. And when dawn came, the cannons opened fire again, undoing hours of desperate work in a few thunderous blows. This cycle repeated day after day. Repair, destroy, repair again. It was a Sisyphean ordeal, and everyone knew it couldn't last forever. But they did it anyway, because to stop was to surrender. Fear seeped into every corner of the city. People jumped at shadows, at rumors of betrayal, at whispers of tunnels being dug beneath them. Mothers hushed children with warnings, "Be quiet, or the Turks will hear you." At night, silence was heavy. Men stood watch on the walls, ears straining for the scrape of shovels underground. Citizens lay awake, listening for alarms that might send them rushing to the battlements. Sleep became fractured, shallow, haunted. And yet fear also became routine. After weeks of bombardment, the roar of cannons became background noise, like thunder before a storm. People learned to live with it, to carry on conversations while walls shook. That's the strange resilience of humans. Even terror can become ordinary if it happens every day. Faith was everywhere. Processions wound through the streets with icons of the Virgin Mary. Priests sprinkled holy water on walls, blessed soldiers led chants in Hagia Sophia. Families gathered nightly for prayers, voices trembling but steady. For many, it was all they had left. Faith couldn't stop cannonballs, but it gave people a sense of meaning. If they were destined to fall, at least they would fall as God's chosen, not as cowards. But not everyone agreed. Some muttered that the union with Rome had angered God, that the Latin masses in Hagia Sophia were a curse. Others whispered that the city was doomed for its sins, pride, greed, betrayal. In every candlelit church, hope and doubt wrestled in equal measure. Imagine being a child in Constantinople in 1453. Your world would have been rubble, dust, and fear. The streets you played in were now filled with collapsed houses. The sound of laughter was drowned out by cannon fire. And yet, children adapt. Some played games among the ruins, pretending to be soldiers, mimicking the battle on the walls. Others carried water to workers or sat quietly in churches, staring up at flickering candles. For them, siege life wasn't the end of an empire. It was simply childhood, harsh, but normal, because they knew no different. Markets still opened, though they were shadows of their former selves. Stalls offered little, a few onions, some dried fish, maybe a strip of cloth salvaged from an abandoned house. prices soared. A loaf of coarse bread could cost a fortune. Coins clinked, but the true currency was food. Merchants haggled bitterly, sometimes accused of profiteering. Soldiers sometimes seized supplies, arguing that defense came before profit. And yet, even in starvation, people still gathered in markets. It was habit, a faint echo of the old city's vibrancy. Sieges breed rumors, and Constantinople was no exception. Some claimed Western fleets were on their way, Venetian armadas, papal crusaders, kings riding to the rescue. Others whispered of secret gates and traitors ready to open them to the Ottomans. Every tavern, every street corner hummed with speculation. Hope rose with each rumor of allies, then collapsed again when no sails appeared on the horizon. The cycle of hope and disappointment wore people down almost as much as hunger. One thing that steadied spirits was Constantine XI himself. He didn't hide in palaces. He walked the streets, inspected repairs, encouraged workers. Citizens saw him laboring beside them, his purple robes dusty, his face lined with fatigue. That mattered. In a city where emperors had often seemed distant, Constantine was present, visible, human. People whispered, "The emperor works with us. He will die with us if we die." In a world where morale was as fragile as the patched walls, his presence was priceless. And yet, life went on. Weddings were held, though they were small and somber. Babies were born, baptized quickly with prayers for survival. Families still gathered at tables, though the meals were meager. People still greeted neighbors, still told stories, still sang hymns. That's what makes siege life so haunting. Amid ruin and fear, people cling stubbornly to normalcy. It's a form of defiance, a refusal to let war erase humanity completely. But beneath all of it, the work, the prayers, the markets, the children's games, was the knowledge that the city could not hold forever. People felt it in their bones. Every cannon shot was a countdown. Every night of repair was just buying another day. And yet, no one gave up. They kept patching, praying, fighting, because to stop was to admit the end. Better to hope for a miracle, however faint, than to surrender to despair. Life inside the walls of Constantinople wasn't just about survival. It was about dignity. It was about people refusing to give up their routines, their faith, their humanity, even as doom loomed over them. We often remember emperors and sultans, but the true tragedy and the true resilience lies in those ordinary lives. The mother rationing bread, the child fetching stones for the wall, the old priest leading prayers with a trembling voice. They knew they were living in the twilight of an empire. And yet, they lived. By May of 1453, the city was exhausted but unbroken. Inside the walls, life limped on, hungry, fearful, faithful, defiant. Outside, Mehmet's army pressed closer, louder, deadlier. The walls groaned under bombardment. The harbor was compromised. And within the city, people braced for whatever came next. Constantinople still lived. But it was a life measured in days. Every siege is fought with weapons, but the War of Constantinople in 1453 was fought just as fiercely with words, symbols, and stories. Both sides told themselves and the world what this fight meant. And in those meanings, you see two cultures colliding, each convinced it carried divine sanction. This wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a clash of civilizations. On one side, the last flickering light of Byzantium, claiming to be Rome, heir to Caesar and Constantine, the guardian of Orthodox Christianity. On the other, the Ottoman Empire, young, expanding, confident, claiming to be the true vessel of destiny, chosen to fulfill prophecy and extend Islam's reach. Each side fought with steel. But they also fought with stories. For Mehmet II, propaganda was simple and powerful. From the beginning, he cast the campaign as a holy war, a jihad. Preachers followed the army, reminding soldiers that the Prophet Muhammad himself had foretold the conquest of Constantinople. One day, Constantinople shall be conquered, the Prophet was said to have declared. Blessed is the commander who conquers it, blessed are his soldiers. That wasn't just a line in a book. It was a rallying cry. Imagine being a young janissary, raised from childhood to fight for the Sultan, hearing that prophecy repeated day after day. Every step you took, every cannon you hauled, wasn't just war. It was fulfilling the words of the prophet. Victory meant paradise. Mehmet knew how to use this. His soldiers didn't see themselves as besiegers of a city, they saw themselves as instruments of God. That belief hardened their resolve. When assaults failed, when men died by the hundreds, faith carried them forward. Inside the walls, the Byzantines answered with their own sacred story. Constantinople wasn't just a city. It was the city, the new Rome, chosen by God, guarded by the Virgin Mary herself. For centuries, priests told tales of angels walking its walls at night, keeping enemies at bay. During the siege, that language intensified. Icons of the Virgin were carried along the battlements. Hymns proclaimed that heaven itself fought with them. Processions wound through the streets, led by priests chanting prayers for deliverance. For many Byzantines, survival wasn't just military. It was spiritual. If Constantinople fell, it would mean not only the loss of their homes, but the collapse of a sacred covenant. Prophecy loomed large on both sides. For the Ottomans, it was the hadith about Constantinople's conquest. For Byzantines, it was older prophecies, some hopeful, some apocalyptic. One claimed that the city would fall, but only after the last emperor turned into marble, hidden beneath the earth, to awaken again when God willed it. Another promised that Constantinople would be lost, then miraculously restored. Yet another warned that sins, pride, greed, corruption would one day doom the empire. These prophecies weren't just background noise. They shaped how people fought, how they prayed, how they endured. Hope and doom walked side by side in every sermon, every whispered conversation. Mehmet also understood the propaganda of image. He made sure his army looked unstoppable, banners flying, drums pounding, cavalry parading before the walls. The sight alone was a weapon. Constantinople's defenders saw not just soldiers, but a tide of symbols, crescents, Quranic verses, disciplined ranks moving like clockwork. Even the cannon fire was propaganda. Each thunderous boom wasn't just destruction, it was a message. Your walls are mortal. Your myths are dying. And when he ordered ships dragged overland into the Golden Horn, it wasn't only a tactical move. It was theater. A way of saying, even your impossible defenses mean nothing to me. Inside the city, Constantine XI tried his own brand of rhetoric. He gave speeches urging his people to see themselves not just as Byzantines, but as Romans, heirs of an unbroken line stretching back to Caesar. He reminded them that surrender meant slavery, but resistance meant honor. In one famous address, he told them, "You know that this city is the eye of the world, the joy of nations, the bulwark of Christians against the infidel. If it falls, then Christendom itself will be shaken." That language mattered. It gave starving, exhausted men something bigger than themselves to fight for. Not just a home, not just a family, but the survival of a civilization. Propaganda wasn't only official. Rumors did their own work. Inside the city, whispers claimed that Western fleets were on their way, that Venetian sails had been spotted, that armies from Hungary or the Pope were marching. Each rumor sparked bursts of hope, and each unfulfilled promise deepened despair. In the Ottoman camp, rumors spread that the Byzantines were weak, starving, divided, that their angels had abandoned them, that the end was certain. Soldiers fed on these stories as much as on their rations. Rumors are oxygen in a siege. They keep spirits burning, even if it's false fire. One of the most striking things about this siege is how visibly it symbolized a clash of civilizations. On one side, Byzantine banners fluttered with Christian crosses. On the other, Ottoman banners shone with crescents. Priests blessed defenders on the walls, while imams blessed attackers outside them. Hymns and Quranic chants rose and clashed in the air. If you stood between the armies at dawn, you might have heard both prayers echoing across the field, each side asking the same God, in different languages, to grant them victory. That's the paradox of holy war, certainty colliding with certainty, each convinced destiny is theirs. This wasn't just a local story. Both sides knew the world was watching. Byzantines wrote letters pleading for help, framing the siege as a struggle for all Christendom. If Constantinople fell, they warned, Europe would be next. Whether true or not, it was effective rhetoric, though not effective enough to move kings already busy with their own wars. For the Ottomans, victory would send its own message. Mehmet wanted Europe to know a new empire had risen, one that claimed Rome's mantle not through diplomacy but through conquest. When Constantinople fell, he would make sure the world understood that Islam had triumphed where generations of armies had failed. In the end, the cannons and soldiers would decide the city's fate. But the propaganda, the stories people told themselves, mattered just as much. For defenders, it gave strength to endure hunger, exhaustion, and hopeless odds. For attackers, it gave zeal to push through failure and losses. And for both, it transformed a military campaign into a cosmic struggle. That's why we still talk about the fall of Constantinople not just as a battle, but as a turning point in world history. It wasn't only about walls and armies. It was about meaning colliding with meaning, cultures colliding with cultures. By May of 1453, the propaganda had done its work. Both sides were convinced they were destined to win. Both prayed louder, sang louder, and fought harder because of it. But destiny doesn't bend to words alone. Soon, the siege would enter its most brutal phase: assaults, counterattacks, tunnels, and blood. And in those coming weeks, words would give way to screams, chants to cannon fire, prophecy to reality. A siege is not just one long wait for starvation or a final breach. It is a contest, blows traded, feints made, nerves tested. And in the opening weeks of April 1453, Mehmet too wanted more than cannon fire to wear down Constantinople. He wanted to storm it outright, to prove to his army and the world that the city could be taken by force. The Ottomans had the numbers. They had the cannons. They had the momentum of history. What they did not have, at least at first, was success. Because when Mehmet ordered his first assaults on the walls, something remarkable happened. Constantinople pushed back. The first assaults were probing attacks. Mehmet sent waves of troops, irregulars, auxiliaries, men not of the elite janissaries, but of the mass levies, to test weak spots. Ladders were carried forward, hooks thrown, shouts rising. But the Theodosian walls, even scarred by cannon fire, were not so easily taken. Defenders rained arrows, hurled stones, poured down boiling water and oil. They cut ropes, smashed ladders, drove spears into hands clutching at the battlements. The irregulars broke and fled, leaving corpses at the base of the walls. It wasn't glorious for the Byzantines, it was desperate, bloody, exhausting. But it was victory, however small. For the first time, people inside the city could believe maybe the walls still had life in them. Central to these successes was Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese captain. With his 700 mercenaries, he organized the defense like a professional. He positioned archers where they could strike most effectively, directed reinforcements to threatened points, and led from the front. Chroniclers describe him as tireless, shouting encouragement, fighting with sword in hand. For the Byzantines, his presence was electrifying. He was the proof that the West had not entirely abandoned them. When his men repelled an Ottoman surge at one of the breaches, cheers echoed along the walls. Some even began to whisper, maybe this mercenary was the miracle they had been waiting for. Imagine the scene during one of these assaults. Drums pounding in the Ottoman camp, horns blaring, chants of Allahu Akbar rising as troops surged forward. From the walls, defenders shouting prayers, bells tolling, arrows hissing through the air. Cannon smoke mingling with torchlight, the screams of the wounded filling the night. For an hour, maybe two, the world was nothing but chaos until the attackers fell back, leaving ladders shattered and bodies sprawled in the dust. Silence returned, broken only by the moans of the dying. And then the defenders, exhausted but still alive, patched the walls again under the cold glow of torches. For Mehmet, these failures were infuriating. He had promised his men victory, glory, even paradise. And yet, the city stood. Every failed assault chipped at morale. Whispers spread in the Ottoman camp. Were the Byzantines truly protected by God? Had others not failed before? Was this city unconquerable after all? Mehmet could not allow doubt to spread. He responded with ruthlessness. Officers who faltered were punished. Soldiers who fled were executed. He reminded his men of the prophet's prophecy of the rewards waiting in heaven. Failure was not an option. But inside the city, those first failed assaults gave the opposite effect, a surge of pride, a flicker of hope. "We can hold," people whispered. "The walls still protect us." The early clashes showed something deeper than tactics. They revealed the true nature of the siege. It was not just a battle of arms, but a battle of wills. The Byzantines had so little left, yet they refused to yield. The Ottomans had overwhelming force, yet they could not break the city in one stroke. It became clear that this would not be a quick conquest. It would be a grind, a wearing down, a test of endurance. And in that test, Constantinople, at least for a while, still had teeth. Victory for the defenders didn't mean joy. It meant casualties, wounded soldiers carried to makeshift infirmaries, priests anointing the dying, families mourning husbands and sons. Every assault repelled was a night of blood spilled on both sides. But in siege warfare, survival itself was triumph. Each failed Ottoman assault meant another day of life, another day to hope for relief from the West, another day to pray for a miracle. For Mehmet, the failures were lessons. He adjusted, refined, waited. If the walls could not be stormed by irregulars, he would unleash the Janissaries later. If ladders failed, cannons would create wider breaches. If morale wavered, he would tighten discipline. The failed assaults weren't the end of his plan. They were the beginning of his understanding. This city would not fall to half measures. To take Constantinople, he would need everything: his cannons, his fleet, his Janissaries, his will. Meanwhile, inside Constantinople, the people clung to each small victory like a drowning man to driftwood. Priests declared the failed assaults proof of divine favor. Children whispered that angels had stood on the battlements. Mothers told their families, "See, the Turks cannot enter. The Virgin protects us still." For a city starving, afraid, and isolated, that hope mattered more than food. It gave them the strength to keep repairing, to keep fighting, to keep believing that perhaps, just perhaps, they could outlast the storm. The first failed assaults are crucial because they show us that Constantinople didn't go quietly. It wasn't a city resigned to death. It fought tooth and nail with whatever strength it had left. And it shows us Mehmet, too, not as an unstoppable force, but as a young sultan learning, adapting, adjusting his strategy. The siege was as much a crucible for him as it was for Constantine XI. By mid-April, the pattern was set. The Ottomans assaulted. The Byzantines repelled. Cannons boomed. Repairs followed. Each day, the walls grew weaker. Each night, defenders grew more exhausted. The first assaults had failed, but no one inside the city believed they had seen the last of them. The real storm, everyone knew, was still to come. A siege is not just one long wait for starvation or a final breach. It is a contest, blows traded, feints made, nerves tested. And in the opening weeks of April 1453, Mehmet too wanted more than cannon fire to wear down Constantinople. He wanted to storm it outright, to prove to his army and the world that the city could be taken by force. The Ottomans had the numbers. They had the cannons. They had the momentum of history. What they did not have, at least at first, was success. Because when Mehmet ordered his first assaults on the walls, something remarkable happened. Constantinople pushed back. The first assaults were probing attacks. Mehmet sent waves of troops, irregulars, auxiliaries, men not of the elite Janissaries, but of the mass levies, to test weak spots. Ladders were carried forward, hooks thrown, shouts rising. But the Theodosian walls, even scarred by cannon fire, were not so easily taken. Defenders rained arrows, hurled stones, poured down boiling water and oil. They cut ropes, smashed ladders, drove spears into hands clutching at the battlements. The irregulars broke and fled, leaving corpses at the base of the walls. It wasn't glorious for the Byzantines, it was desperate, bloody, exhausting. But it was victory, however small. For the first time, people inside the city could believe maybe the walls still had life in them. Central to these successes was Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese captain. With his 700 mercenaries, he organized the defense like a professional. He positioned archers where they could strike most effectively, directed reinforcements to threatened points, and led from the front. Chroniclers describe him as tireless, shouting encouragement, fighting with sword in hand. For the Byzantines, his presence was electrifying. He was the proof that the West had not entirely abandoned them. When his men repelled an Ottoman surge at one of the breaches, cheers echoed along the walls. Some even began to whisper, maybe this mercenary was the miracle they had been waiting for. Imagine the scene during one of these assaults. Drums pounding in the Ottoman camp, horns blaring, chants of Allahu Akbar rising as troops surged forward. From the walls, defenders shouting prayers, bells tolling, arrows hissing through the air. Cannon smoke mingling with torchlight, the screams of the wounded filling the night. For an hour, maybe two, the world was nothing but chaos until the attackers fell back, leaving ladders shattered and bodies sprawled in the dust. Silence returned, broken only by the moans of the dying. And then the defenders, exhausted but still alive, patched the walls again under the cold glow of torches. For Mehmet, these failures were infuriating. He had promised his men victory, glory, even paradise. And yet, the city stood. Every failed assault chipped at morale. Whispers spread in the Ottoman camp. Were the Byzantines truly protected by God? Had others not failed before? Was this city unconquerable after all? Mehmet could not allow doubt to spread. He responded with ruthlessness. Officers who faltered were punished. Soldiers who fled were executed. He reminded his men of the prophet's prophecy, of the rewards waiting in heaven. Failure was not an option. But inside the city, those first failed assaults gave the opposite effect, a surge of pride, a flicker of hope. We can hold, people whispered. The walls still protect us. The early clashes showed something deeper than tactics. They revealed the true nature of the siege. It was not just a battle of arms, but a battle of wills. The Byzantines had so little left, yet they refused to yield. The Ottomans had overwhelming force, yet they could not break the city in one stroke. It became clear that this would not be a quick conquest. It would be a grind, a wearing down, a test of endurance. And in that test, Constantinople, at least for a while, still had teeth. Victory for the defenders didn't mean joy. It meant casualties, wounded soldiers carried to makeshift infirmaries, priests anointing the dying, families mourning husbands and sons. Every assault repelled was a night of blood spilled on both sides. But in siege warfare, survival itself was triumph. Each failed Ottoman assault meant another day of life, another day to hope for relief from the West, another day to pray for a miracle. For Mehmet, the failures were lessons. He adjusted, refined, waited. If the walls could not be stormed by irregulars, he would unleash the janissaries later. If ladders failed, cannons would create wider breaches. If morale wavered, he would tighten discipline. The failed assaults weren't the end of his plan. They were the beginning of his understanding. This city would not fall to half measures. To take Constantinople, he would need everything: his cannons, his fleet, his janissaries, his will. Meanwhile, inside Constantinople, the people clung to each small victory like a drowning man to driftwood. Priests declared the failed assaults proof of divine favor. Children whispered that angels had stood on the battlements. Mothers told their families, "See, the Turks cannot enter. The Virgin protects us still." For a city starving, afraid, and isolated, that hope mattered more than food. It gave them the strength to keep repairing, to keep fighting, to keep believing that perhaps, just perhaps, they could outlast the storm. The first failed assaults are crucial because they show us that Constantinople didn't go quietly. It wasn't a city resigned to death. It fought tooth and nail with whatever strength it had left. And it shows us Mehmet, too, not as an unstoppable force, but as a young sultan learning, adapting, adjusting his strategy. The siege was as much a crucible for him as it was for Constantine XI. By mid-April, the pattern was set. The Ottomans assaulted. The Byzantines repelled. Cannons boomed. Repairs followed. Each day, the walls grew weaker. Each night, defenders grew more exhausted. The first assaults had failed, but no one inside the city believed they had seen the last of them. The real storm, everyone knew, was still to come. For weeks, the people of Constantinople had lived under a suffocating blockade. The Ottomans controlled the land. Their ships prowled the Bosphorus and the Sea of Marmara, hemming the city in. Food dwindled. Morale frayed. Every rumor of a relief fleet from the west fizzled into nothing. And then, on a morning in April, sails appeared on the horizon. For Christian ships, 3 Genoese and 1 Byzantine, laden with grain and supplies, had dared to challenge Mehmet's blockade. For a city that had forgotten what hope felt like, the sight of those sails was like a miracle painted against the sea. Bells rang. Crowds gathered on the sea walls, pointing, shouting, weeping. Salvation, some cried. The West has come. But salvation would not come cheaply. Mehmet had stationed around 150 ships to bottle the city. They weren't all sleek war galleys. Some were transports, supply vessels, smaller craft. But together, they formed a cordon that was meant to choke Constantinople's last lifeline. The chain across the Golden Horn protected the harbor. But what use was a safe harbor if no friendly ship could reach it? Every day that passed under blockade meant less food, less hope. The Ottomans knew it. The Byzantines knew it. And so when those 4 ships appeared, the entire siege seemed to hang on their fate. The Ottoman fleet moved swiftly to intercept. Dozens of galleys fanned out, oars churning, drums pounding. From the city's walls, it must have looked hopeless, for ships against many times their number. People prayed, crossed themselves, clutched icons. But the ships were stout, high-sided merchantmen, built for the open sea, not fragile like the low Ottoman galleys. As the fleets collided, the water erupted into chaos, ramming, boarding attempts, arrows hissing, cannons thundering from decks. Time and again, Ottoman galleys swarmed the Christian ships, only to be repelled. Grappling hooks were cut loose, ladders pushed back, soldiers hurled into the waves. The defenders on the ships fought like men possessed, knowing that behind them was not just victory or defeat, but the fate of a city. From the walls, the Byzantines roared encouragement. Chroniclers describe crowds screaming prayers, urging the ships on, waving arms as if they could push them forward with sheer will. The battle raged for hours. The Ottomans tried to encircle, to overwhelm, to ram. But then, fortune intervened. The wind shifted, filling the sails of the Christian ships. They surged forward, dragging their attackers with them, breaking through the blockade line. As they neared the Golden Horn, Byzantine crews scrambled to lower the great chain. The defenders pulled, heaved, sweated, until the chain dipped just enough. And then, with sails straining, oars churning, the 4 ships slipped into the harbor. The chain slammed back into place. The Ottomans, furious, were left outside, their prey escaped. When the ships entered the Golden Horn, Constantinople erupted. Bells rang from every church. Crowds cheered, sobbed, embraced one another. The defenders on the walls waved weapons in triumph. Children shouted, "God has saved us." For a city that had lived on despair, this was oxygen. It didn't matter that it was only 4 ships. In that moment, it felt like proof that miracles were still possible, that the West hadn't forgotten them entirely, that maybe, just maybe, rescue is coming. For Mehmet, the escape was intolerable. His fleet had been humiliated before the eyes of both armies. Worse, his soldiers had watched their sultan fail. That kind of embarrassment could poison morale. The young ruler exploded in rage. He summoned his admiral, Hamza Bey, and some sources say he had him whipped or demoted on the spot. Others say Mehmet threatened far worse. Whether the stories are exaggerated or not, the message was clear: failure was not an option. And Mehmet was not a man to brood quietly. If ships could not break the chain from outside, then he would bring ships inside, even if it meant dragging them over land. Inside Constantinople, the arrival of the ships did more than feed bellies. It fed spirits. The grain they carried was welcome, yes. But the true nourishment was psychological. People whispered that the Venetians were coming with more, that the Pope's fleet was right behind, that kings and crusaders were assembling armies. None of it was true. But hope is a dangerous fuel. It burns bright, even if it cannot last. For a few days, The city walked lighter, sang louder, believed harder. But hope is fragile against reality. Within days, Mehmet unveiled his audacious plan to bypass the chain by hauling ships overland into the Golden Horn. The defenders' cheers turned to dread. Their miracle had lasted only long enough to make its end sting worse. The 4 ships had bought Constantinople time, but not salvation. Why does this naval clash matter so much? Not because it turned the tide of the siege, it didn't. For ships of grain couldn't feed a city for long. But because it was a symbol. For the defenders, it proved they could win small victories, that God might still intervene. For the Ottomans, it was a reminder that even overwhelming numbers weren't enough without ingenuity, a lesson Mehmet immediately applied with his overland ship maneuver. Symbols can sustain or destroy morale. And in this siege, morale was as critical as stone. For a few nights after the ship's arrival, Constantinople felt almost alive again. Candles burned brighter in Hagia Sophia. Hymns were sung louder. Soldiers on the walls stood taller. But hunger returned quickly. Rumors of larger fleets came to nothing. The Ottomans' cannons kept pounding. And soon, Mehmet's ingenuity erased the victory altogether. Hope from the sea had come and gone. By early May, the fleeting triumph had faded. The ships had entered, yes, but the blockade was stronger than ever. The chain across the Golden Horn had been bypassed. The cannons still roared. The city had tasted hope, only to have it torn away. And in that bitter swing, from despair to joy to despair again, you feel the human cost of the siege more than in any number of cannonballs. For 1,000 years, the massive iron chain stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn had been Constantinople's pride. Thick as a man's body, anchored to towers, drawn taut across the water, it was an immovable barrier. No fleet could ram through without splintering. No enemy could sail past without permission. It was the city's great trump card, the secret weapon that had foiled Arab fleets, Rus raiders, and even crusaders. When those 4 Christian ships slipped past the Ottoman blockade and into the harbor, the defenders pointed to the chain and said, "Here is our salvation. The Horn is safe. The Turks will never breach it." But Mehmet too was not a man who accepted never. The sight of those 4 ships sailing into the harbor in full view of his fleet was a humiliation Mehmet could not endure. His carefully constructed aura of inevitability cracked. Soldiers had whispered. Officers had hesitated. Even he had tasted the sting of doubt. But Mehmet's genius lay in turning setbacks into opportunities. If the chain mocked him, he would mock it in return. If the defenders trusted it, he would make it useless. And so, he conceived an idea that seemed closer to madness than strategy. He would move ships overland. Historians still marvel at it. Ships hauled across hills? Over rough terrain? Across soil, stone, and forest? But Mehmet was serious. He ordered carpenters to build wooden tracks. Oxen and soldiers prepared ropes and pulleys. Logs were greased with animal fat to reduce friction. This wasn't improvisation. It was engineering. Step by step, the impossible became practical. Galleys were dragged from the Bosphorus, rolled across the heights of Galata, and lowered into the calm waters of the Golden Horn, behind the chain, inside the defenders' safe harbor. Chroniclers describe it as if the ships had flown through the air, appearing overnight like a magician's trick. And for the Byzantines, that's exactly how it felt: sorcery, a miracle in reverse. The operation happened largely at night, under cover of darkness. From the walls, defenders saw torchlight flickering on the hills, but couldn't make sense of it. Some thought the Ottomans were building siege towers, others that they were setting campfires. By dawn, the truth revealed itself. Sails rose inside the Golden Horn. Ottoman ships floated where none should be. The chain still stretched across the harbor's mouth, but it no longer mattered. The psychological effect was catastrophic. For weeks, defenders had said, "At least the Horn is safe. At least one flank is secure." Now, that security was gone. From the walls, citizens stared in disbelief. Some wept openly. Others fell silent, stunned. Priests who had preached that the Virgin would protect the city now struggled to explain how enemy ships had appeared in holy waters. The miracle of the 4 ships had been erased in a single audacious stroke. The chain was not broken. It was outflanked. And in that moment, centuries of faith in Constantinople's defenses dissolved. With Ottoman ships inside the Golden Horn, the city faced pressure from yet another direction. The seawalls along the harbor were lower, thinner, less formidable than the massive Theodosian fortifications. Now, they too had to be defended. Resources that were already stretched paper-thin were pulled even tighter. Soldiers and sailors were shifted to new posts. Watchtowers that had been neglected suddenly became critical. And every day, cannon fire rained not only from the land but from ships inside the Horn. The defenders had fought like lions on the land walls. Now they had to fight like fishers and sailors on the sea walls too. It was a burden many could hardly bear. It's easy to underestimate what Mehmed accomplished here. He didn't just outmaneuver a physical barrier. He shattered the defenders' confidence in their own traditions. The chain had been more than iron. It had been a symbol, a guarantee, a comfort. By bypassing it, Mehmet proved that no defense was sacred, no tradition unassailable. He was telling the city, nothing you rely on will save you. Not your walls, not your harbors, not your myths. That was warfare at its most devastating, breaking the enemy's mind before breaking their body. Inside the city, debates raged. Some argued it was proof that God had abandoned them, punishment for their sins or for the hated union with Rome. Others said it was a test of faith, that miracles often came only when all seemed lost. Soldiers cursed, priests prayed louder, citizens despaired. Constantine XI himself tried to rally spirits, insisting that the city would endure. But even he must have felt the weight of the truth. Constantinople's defenses were being dismantled piece by piece. The episode of the chain echoed far beyond Constantinople. Survivors who escaped later carried the story to Europe, where it became a symbol of Ottoman audacity. In taverns in Venice, Genoa, and Florence, sailors whispered of the Sultan who had dragged ships across mountains. It was more than a tactic. It was theater, designed to awe allies and terrify enemies. And it worked. The outflanking of the chain mattered not only tactically but psychologically. Tactically, it opened a new front in the siege, stretching defenders to the breaking point. Psychologically, it demolished one of the last illusions of safety. Constantinople was no longer defending a city with clever tricks and ancient engineering. It was defending a city naked before ingenuity and ambition. By mid-May, the defenders were exhausted, the sea walls now under attack, the land walls still battered daily by cannon fire. The hope brought by the 4 Christian ships had dissolved. The chain, their proudest defense, had been nullified. The Ottomans had proven relentless, adaptive, unstoppable. And inside the city, faith began to falter. The end, once unthinkable, now felt inevitable. If the siege of Constantinople was a battle of cannons, then it was also a battle of shovels, stones, and bare hands. Every day, Mehmet's artillery pounded the Theodosian walls. Every night, the defenders tried to patch them back together. It became the city's heartbeat, destruction at dawn, repair at dusk, exhaustion by midnight. This wasn't engineering in the neat sense of the word. It was improvisation, desperation, and sheer human will. For weeks, the defenders of Constantinople lived in a cycle of collapse and repair, a Sisyphean task where the reward for hard labor was only a few more hours of survival. Urban supercannon and the smaller Ottoman bombards did what no enemy had done before. They opened real breaches in the Theodosian walls. The triple line of fortifications, once unassailable, now cracked and crumbled under the relentless hammering of stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds. Gaps yawned where towers had once stood tall. Curtain walls slumped into heaps of rubble. Dust filled the air, choking defenders as they scrambled to respond. Each boom was followed by the sickening crash of masonry, followed by the frantic shouts of men rushing to fill the gap. For a city that had trusted those walls for 1,000 years, the sight was more terrifying than any army. The stone itself was failing them. Repairing the walls was not just a job for soldiers. Everyone worked. Men carried stones and timbers. Women filled baskets of earth, carried water, hauled rubble. Children fetched tools, dragged planks, sometimes even carried sandbags as if they were toys. Priests joined in too, chanting prayers while lifting stones, blessing the repairs as they rose. The emperor himself, Constantine XI, labored alongside his people, shoveling earth, giving orders, encouraging workers with words and example. It turned the city into one vast construction site. By night, torches flickered along the walls, throwing shadows of endless movement, silhouettes bent under loads, voices calling, hammers pounding. The defenders were not just soldiers, they were masons, carpenters, haulers. The materials were whatever they could find. Rubble from collapsed houses, timber from ruined churches, furniture broken apart and turned into barricades, barrels filled with earth, bags stuffed with wool or straw. Even statues and decorative stones were dragged from public squares and smashed into filler. The once proud city, famous for its mosaics and churches, was cannibalizing itself for survival. Beauty became rubble, rubble became defense. The hardest part wasn't the danger, though Ottoman fire sometimes continued into the night. It was the exhaustion. Defenders who had fought all day now lifted stones all night. Hands blistered, backs ached, bodies trembled from lack of sleep. Some collapsed at their posts, tools still in hand. Others worked until they vomited from fatigue. Yet the work had to continue, because if even one breach remained open by dawn, the next Ottoman assault might pour through. Every patched hole was another day of life. Every missed repair was the city's death. Constantine Xi's role in this nightly labor became legendary. Chroniclers record that he walked the walls by torchlight, shovel in hand, lifting baskets, speaking to laborers by name. He reminded them that they were not just patching stone, they were patching the body of Christendom itself. It mattered. In a city where morale was stretched thin, the sight of the emperor sweating, dusty, exhausted like any common man inspired people to keep going. They whispered, "Our emperor works with us. Our emperor suffers with us. Our emperor will die with us if need be." That bond gave the city strength, fragile, fleeting, but real. And yet, for all the work, the walls never regained their old strength. Patches of earth and timber could not equal cut stone. Each new bombardment undid hours of labor. It was like trying to dam a river with driftwood. The defenders knew it. Each night, as they hauled rubble, they whispered to one another, "How long can this last?" Some said weeks. Others, only days. Few believed they could endure forever. But they labored anyway. Because what else could they do? To stop working was to surrender. Priests framed the repairs as holy labor. Every stone lifted, every basket filled, was offered as prayer. People told themselves that their sweat was as important as their hymns, that God would see their effort and bless it with protection. This fusion of faith and work kept many going. But others muttered darker words, that the repairs were futile, that only a miracle could save them, that they were building walls of sand against a sea of iron. From their camp, the Ottomans saw the torches at night, the frantic scurrying of workers. Mehmet understood the strain it caused. He let the pattern continue, bombard by day, repairs by night, knowing it would wear the defenders down. He could afford patience. They could not. Sometimes he ordered sudden bombardments at night, catching workers off guard, killing dozens in showers of rubble. It was ruthless, but it reminded the city that even the dark offered no safety. Think of the faces in those nights. A boy of 12, carrying stones heavier than he could manage. A woman, sleeves rolled, sweat streaking her face as she dragged baskets of earth. An old priest, back bent, mumbling prayers as he leaned on a shovel. They were not warriors. They were citizens, turned into builders and soldiers by necessity. Every patched wall was their blood, their labor, their last offering to a dying empire. The desperate repairs of Constantinople matter because they show us the siege at its most human. It wasn't just emperors and sultans, cannons and armies. It was ordinary people lifting stones with blistered hands, refusing to let their city die without a fight. It also shows the futility of resistance against new technology. No matter how hard they worked, patched walls could not withstand modern artillery. The age of stone fortresses was over. Constantinople was simply the last, most tragic example. By late May, the repairs were slowing. People were too exhausted. Materials were running out. The walls looked less like fortifications and more like ragged scars. Constantinople still stood, but barely. Its walls were no longer the pride of Rome. They were a patchwork of rubble and faith, trembling under each new cannon shot. The city's strength was measured now not in stone, but in how long its people could endure. And time was running out. For weeks, Constantinople's defenders had fought bravely, fending off irregulars, mercenaries, and waves of Ottoman levies. But everyone knew those were not the Sultan's best. Mehmet had held back his most fearsome weapon, the Janissaries. The Janissaries weren't just soldiers. They were the embodiment of the Ottoman state's ambition, disciplined, loyal, and terrifying. To face them was to face an army that felt less like a mob and more like a machine. When Mehmet began to commit them more fully to the siege in May 1453, the defenders felt the pressure sharpen into something colder, deadlier, and more inevitable. The Janissaries, new troops, were unlike anything Europe had seen. They weren't nobles with their own agendas, like Western knights. They weren't temporary conscripts, like many of the levied troops in medieval armies. They were a standing army, raised through the Devshirme system, Christian boys taken from the Balkans, converted to Islam, and trained from childhood to serve the Sultan. This upbringing forged men who were utterly loyal, with no ties to family or land to distract them. They drilled constantly, trained with bows, swords, pikes, and, increasingly, firearms. Their discipline was legendary. They obeyed orders without hesitation, fought in silence when commanded, and stood their ground even under horrific conditions. By 1453, they were the backbone of Mehmet's empire, the stormtroopers of his ambitions. Mehmet was too shrewd to waste them on early probing assaults. Those first waves of irregulars and levies had been sacrifices, cannon fodder to test the defenses, exhaust the defenders, and reveal weak points. But once the walls were cracked, once morale inside the city was fraying, once fatigue had dulled the defenders' reflexes, that's when Mehmet unleashed the Janissaries. Their mere presence near the front lines changed the tenor of the siege. Drums beat more steadily. Orders snapped more crisply. Even from the walls, defenders could see the difference, lines of soldiers moving in order, their uniforms neat, their discipline unshaken. It was like watching storm clouds gather before lightning struck. When the Janissaries advanced, it wasn't the chaotic rush of irregulars. It was precision. Shields locked, ladders raised in unison, volleys of arrows or gunfire loosed in rhythm. Their discipline allowed them to press attacks longer, endure losses without collapsing, and adapt when defenders countered. For the weary Byzantines, who had grown accustomed to breaking poorly organized assaults, this was terrifying. Suddenly, the enemy wasn't just a tide of men. It was a wall of iron pressing forward. At first, Mehmet used them sparingly, small detachments to stiffen other units, to keep the defenders constantly on edge. Then, as the days wore on, he committed them more fully. Skirmishes turned sharper, assaults more coordinated. Each time the Janissaries came forward, defenders braced themselves for their hardest fight. And each time they repelled them barely, but at a cost. More men wounded, more exhaustion, more morale chipped away. The Janissaries didn't need to win outright in those moments. They only needed to grind the defenders down. There was bitter irony in who these Janissaries were. Many had been born Christians, Greek, Serbian, Albanian boys taken years before. Now, as men, they fought to destroy the empire that had once claimed their faith. For Byzantines on the walls, it must have been haunting. The faces of the enemy might have resembled their own cousins, their own lost kin. And yet those men now marched under the crescent banner, their loyalty given wholly to Mehmet. It was not just war. It was the cruel recycling of their own children into weapons against them. The Genoese captain, Giovanni Giustiniani, rose to the challenge. His mercenaries were perhaps the only troops inside Constantinople disciplined enough to face the Janissaries on equal terms. Time and again, his men met their assaults with countervolleys, steady shields, and fierce resistance. For days, it was a duel of elites, Janissaries hammering at the breaches, Genoese mercenaries holding the line, each side paying in blood. The ordinary Byzantine defenders looked on with awe and relief as Justiniani's men shouldered the worst of it. But even he could not hold forever. The psychological weight of the Janissaries was immense. Citizens watching from towers whispered that the end must be near, because the Sultan's lions had finally been unleashed. Soldiers muttered prayers, crossing themselves before facing the next assault. Priests tried to steady them with words, "They are men like you. God fights for us." But everyone knew these were not ordinary men. These were Mehmet's chosen. And their relentless pressure wore down more than walls. It wore down hearts. Mehmet used the Janissaries not just as shock troops, but as a weapon of patience. He rotated them, kept them supplied, never overcommit. He let the rest of his army absorb losses while the Janissaries remained fresh enough to deliver the final blow. It was a masterclass in restraint. He could have hurled them at the walls in the first week. Instead, he waited until the city was truly gasping. When they finally moved in force, it would not be to probe, it would be to kill. By late May, every appearance of the Janissaries was like a tolling bell. The breaches widened. The repairs grew weaker. The defenders, already exhausted by nights of labor and days of fighting, could barely withstand the relentless rhythm. Still they resisted. Still they filled the gaps with rubble and corpses. Still they fought with a kind of desperation that defies words. But against the Janissaries, desperation was no match for discipline. The role of the Janissaries in the Fall of Constantinople matters because it highlights the shift in warfare. This wasn't feudal levies crashing into stone walls. This was a professional army, drilled and relentless, combined with artillery and naval pressure. It was the future of war, and Constantinople, with its dwindling defenders, represented the past. It also mattered because of the human tragedy. Christians turned into Janissaries, fighting their ancestral capital, Genoese mercenaries standing as the city's last elite shield, an emperor laboring alongside citizens who had no chance against a machine of empire. By the final week of May, the Janissaries had become a constant presence at the walls. They had not yet broken through, but everyone knew they soon would. The pressure was no longer just from cannons or numbers. It was from the knowledge that Mehmet's finest stood waiting, patient, ready to deliver the killing blow. And when they came again, Constantinople might not withstand them. As cannon fire shook Constantinople's walls and Janissaries pressed harder with each passing day, one question echoed through the city like a heartbeat: where is the West? For decades, Byzantium had leaned on its claim as the bulwark of Christendom. Priests had preached that if Constantinople ever fell, all of Europe would tremble. And yet, as May of 1453 wore on, no great crusading host marched from Hungary, no fleet of Venetian galleys filled the horizon, no papal banners appeared over the waves. The city begged. The emperor pleaded. But help, real help, never came. In the months before the siege, Constantine XI had sent letters everywhere he could. To the Pope, to Venice, to Genoa, to the kings of France and Aragon, to the Duke of Burgundy, to anyone who might hear his cry. The message was clear and desperate: if Constantinople falls, Christendom itself will be in danger. The Turks will pour into Europe. Save us, and you save yourselves. But letters are slow. Politics is slower. And Europe, fractured by its own rivalries, simply wasn't ready to rally. The Pope, Nicholas V, had pushed for union between the Eastern and Western churches. He argued that this was the condition for Western aid. If Byzantium recognized papal authority, Christendom would stand together. Constantine, desperate, had agreed in theory. In 1452, a formal ceremony of union was held in Hagia Sophia, with a cardinal from Rome presiding. But the act was bitterly contested. Many Orthodox clergy and citizens rejected it outright. Better the turban of the Turk than the tiara of the Pope, they said. So when Constantinople cried for help, the West hesitated. Why bleed for a people who cursed you? Why pour gold and ships into a city already half dead, whose priests still spat on Catholic ritual? The Pope did send a handful of volunteers and funds, a token gesture, not a crusade. But by the spring of 1453, Nicholas V's attention was already divided. Renaissance projects in Rome consumed him more than the plight of a distant, crumbling empire. Venice had the most to lose. Constantinople was vital to trade with the Black Sea. But Venice also had lucrative treaties with the Ottomans. War threatened profit on both sides. So the Venetian Senate hesitated. Some galleys were dispatched, yes, but too few and too late. They debated endlessly, balancing ledgers while cannonballs smashed Constantinople's walls. For Venetians inside the city, fighting shoulder to shoulder with Byzantines, this hesitation was betrayal. For the Senate back home, it was pragmatism. To them, Constantinople looked doomed, and Venetians were too practical to gamble everything on a lost cause. Genoa, Venice's old rival, was in no better position. Its colony at Galata, across the Golden Horn, sat awkwardly neutral. The Genoese there declared themselves uninvolved, unwilling to provoke Mehmet directly. Yet individuals like Giovanni Giustiniani came with mercenaries, fighting bravely in defense of the walls. So Constantinople received Genoese courage, but not Genoese fleets. As for the monarchs of Europe, France, England, Aragon, Hungary, they were consumed by their own quarrels. France reeled from the 100 Years' War. England faced civil strife. Hungary had fought the Ottomans before, but its king, Ladislaus, was entangled in regional politics. To Western courts, Constantinople was distant, exotic, a relic of another age. Some still called the Byzantines Greeks, not Romans, dismissing their claims to be the heirs of empire. Why save a city that seemed already half lost, led by a ruler most had never met, on the far side of seas that most of their peasants would never see? And yet, inside Constantinople, people believed. They had to. Rumors spread daily. A Venetian fleet has left port. The Hungarians are marching. The Pope's army is on its way. Crowds gathered on the seawalls, scanning the horizon for sails. Children were told to watch the skies for heavenly signs. Priests promised that God would not allow the city to fall without sending help. But each day, the horizon stayed empty. Each night, the cannons roared again. Hope became a cruel cycle, raised by rumor, crushed by silence. Emperor Constantine XI bore this weight more than anyone. He had staked his city's survival on Western aid. He had endured the wrath of his own priests to accept union with Rome. He had begged in letter after letter. And yet, he stood alone. Chroniclers describe him growing graver, more solemn as May wore on. He spoke less of salvation from the West and more of honor, duty, and sacrifice. It was as if he realized at last that no fleet was coming. No crusade would ride to his rescue. He and his people would die as they had lived, alone, defending what remained of their empire with their own blood. For the citizens of Constantinople, the bitterness was sharp. For centuries they had been told they were the shield of Christendom. Now, when the blade was at their throats, that Christendom turned away. It felt like betrayal. Not just by kings and popes, but by God himself. Some muttered that the West had never cared, that Byzantium had been used and abandoned. Others clung to faith, insisting that deliverance might still come in the final hour. But the silence from the horizon grew louder than any sermon. The last appeals to the West matter because they reveal the isolation of Byzantium at its end. Constantinople wasn't just defeated by Ottoman cannons, it was defeated by Europe's indifference. It also shows the tragic irony. The empire that had once been the center of the Christian world, that had sent missionaries and shaped theology, now begged for help like a beggar at the gates of kingdoms that had once looked up to it. And no one came. By late May, the truth was undeniable. The West would not arrive in time. The city's defenders could no longer pin their hopes on sails in the distance. All they had left was their own courage, their own emperor, their own faith. Constantinople would fight and fall alone. By the third week of May 1453, the sound of cannon fire had become as constant as breathing. Day and night, the Ottoman bombardment hammered the Theodosian walls, shaking the city to its foundations. At first, the defenders had met each crash with frantic repairs, filling gaps with rubble, earth, timber, anything that could be carried. But there comes a point when even the strongest hands can no longer hold back the tide. That point had arrived. The breaches in Constantinople's walls, once patched each night with heroic effort, now yawned wider than they could be closed. The walls that had stood for 1,000 years were no longer a defense. They were ruins waiting to be overrun. Urban supercannon, along with a dozen smaller bombards, had chewed relentlessly at the same sections of wall. The great stone balls, each weighing hundreds of pounds, slammed into masonry already weakened from weeks of pounding. Cracks spread like veins. Towers leaned precariously. Entire sections slumped into rubble. The defenders watched helplessly as their city's armor peeled away layer by layer. Each new shot shook the earth, sending clouds of dust billowing into the streets. Children clung to their mothers. Soldiers braced for the next thunderclap. Priests whispered prayers drowned out by the roar. What had once been a fortress now looked like an open wound. For weeks, the people of Constantinople had performed nightly miracles. They had rebuilt towers with barrels of earth. They had filled breaches with broken statues and splintered furniture. They had shoveled rubble until their hands bled. But now the gaps were too wide. Some breaches stretched 50, even 100 feet. Filling them with rubble only created mounds of loose earth, easily swept aside by the next assault. Timber reinforcements splintered under fresh bombardment. The defenders labored on, but in their hearts they knew they were patching death itself. Still they worked. Because not working meant surrender. Constantine XI never left the walls. He spent his days walking the ramparts, inspecting repairs, speaking to soldiers and citizens alike. Chroniclers describe him as grave but calm, a man who had shed illusions but not resolve. At one gaping breach near the gate of St. Romanus, he reportedly paused and said quietly, "Here the city will fall." He didn't say if. He said where. And yet, he did not retreat. He ordered defenses strengthened as best they could be. He stationed Giustiniani and his Genoese mercenaries at the weakest points, knowing they were the only troops disciplined enough to stand when the walls crumbled. He prepared not for survival, but for honor. From the streets and rooftops, ordinary citizens watched the walls collapse with horror. For generations, they had told themselves the walls were invincible, guarded by angels, blessed by God. Now they saw them reduced to rubble by human hands and iron shot. The psychological blow was immense. Mothers wept openly. Old men muttered that the end of the world had come. Children clutched icons and asked why the Virgin no longer walked the ramparts. Still, when called to work, they came. They carried baskets of earth, dragged timbers, filled gaps. Not because they believed the repairs would hold, but because it was all they had left to give. In the Ottoman camp, Mehmet watched the breaches widen with satisfaction. His gamble on artillery had paid off. Where countless armies had failed against the walls of Constantinople, he had succeeded. But he did not rush. He let the cannons roar day after day, knowing every shot broke not just stone, but spirit. He ordered mock assaults to test the defenders, to keep them awake and afraid. He tightened the blockade, cutting off the last trickle of supplies. He was strangling the city slowly, methodically, until the final assault would be irresistible. At the great breach near the Lycus Valley, Giustiniani and his Genoese prepared for the inevitable. They dug ditches, raised palisades, planted stakes, turned the ruins into improvised barricades. His men, weary but disciplined, knew they were standing at the future killing ground. They joked darkly that they were building their own graves. And in a sense, they were right. Every day, the sound of bombardment grew louder. Every night, the walls crumbled further. Every dawn, the breaches stretched wider. The rhythm of destruction became a drumbeat of inevitability. Inside the city, people prayed for a miracle. Outside, Mehmet prepared to deliver certainty. The distance between those two realities narrowed with every cannon shot. Even in these final days, some argued for surrender. Better to yield and live under the Sultan than to see the city annihilated. But Constantine refused. To surrender is to dishonor ourselves before God and man, he told his council. The decision sealed the city's fate. There would be no compromise, no negotiated mercy. Constantinople would fall in blood, not in ink. The widening of the final breaches matters because it marks the point where the city's defense shifted from improbable to impossible. No longer could stone save them. No longer could repairs keep pace. The walls that had been the pride of Rome and Byzantium were undone by gunpowder. It also marks the shift in psychology, from hope of survival to acceptance of death, from dreams of rescue to prayers for a good end. Constantinople, once the queen of cities, had become a tomb waiting to be sealed. By May 27th, the breaches yawned wide and unfixable. The cannons had done their work. The city stood in name only. Behind the rubble, weary men and women clutched weapons, waiting for the final storm. And Mehmet, watching from his camp, knew the time had come. The final assault was days away. By late May, Constantinople's fate was no longer a question. The breaches in the walls yawned wide, the Ottomans pressed from every side, and no help had come from the west. The city that had been the beating heart of empire was a few days from death. And so, on the night of May 28th, 1453, the people of Constantinople gathered in Hagia Sophia for one final liturgy. It was not simply a religious service. It was a farewell to their city, to their empire, to a way of life that had endured for over 1,000 years. To understand what that night meant, you have to understand what Hagia Sophia was. Built in the 6th century by Emperor Justinian, it had been the crown jewel of Christendom for nearly a millennium. Its massive dome seemed to float on air, its mosaics glittered with gold, its vast space swallowed thousands of voices at once. For generations, emperors had been crowned there, patriarchs enthroned, councils convened. It was more than a church. It was Byzantium itself, in stone and light. So when the city prepared for its final night, there was only one place to go. That evening, as the sun sank and shadows lengthened, people streamed toward Hagia Sophia from every district. Soldiers left their posts for a few hours. Families walked together, clutching candles. Priests led processions with icons held high. Even Emperor Constantine XI made his way there, setting aside his sword long enough to stand with his people as one of them. Inside, the vast space filled with humanity, nobles and beggars, merchants and monks, Greeks, Venetians, Genoese, Orthodox and Catholic alike. For once, the bitter divisions that had split the city melted away. There were no more arguments about union or heresy, no more mutterings of better the Turk than the Pope. On that night, they were all simply Christians, standing together on the brink of eternity. As incense rose and candles flickered, the voices of the choir filled the dome with ancient hymns. Priests chanted the divine liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, the same prayers that had been sung in Hagia Sophia for nearly 1,000 years. People wept openly. Mothers held their children close. Soldiers bowed their heads, knowing they might die within hours. The emperor himself received communion, alongside ordinary citizens, a final act of unity between ruler and ruled. For many, it was the first time they had seen Orthodox and Catholic clergy stand side by side in prayer. The union of the churches, so bitterly contested, was now made real by desperation. No one cared about theological disputes anymore. They cared only about facing death together. Imagine standing there, hearing those ancient chants echo under the Great Dome, knowing it was the last time. The mosaics of Christ Pantocrator looked down from the apse, the golden walls glowed in candlelight, and outside the walls, Ottoman cannons waited to finish their work. For centuries, people had believed Hagia Sophia was divinely protected, that no enemy could ever profane it. Now, the faithful inside prayed with trembling voices, asking God to spare their souls even if their city was lost. Some chroniclers say the atmosphere was so heavy, so charged, that people felt as if heaven itself had descended into the church. Others wrote of silence broken only by weeping, as thousands clung to one another for courage. At some point that evening, Constantine XI is said to have addressed his people. He thanked them for their loyalty, asked forgiveness for his sins, and urged them to fight with courage. Then, according to some accounts, he slipped quietly away, visiting his closest companions, embracing them, and preparing himself to die as their emperor. Whether every detail is true or embroidered later, the essence is clear. He chose to face the end not as a distant sovereign, but as a man among men, sharing their faith, their fears, their fate. Even in that final liturgy, prophecy lingered. Some whispered of the old tale that when the Turks entered Hagia Sophia, an angel would descend, turn the last emperor into marble, and hide him beneath the earth until the city was restored. Others clung to the hope that God would send a miracle at the last moment, as he had in ages past. But most seemed to know that the miracle would not come. Their prayers that night were not for rescue, but for peace, for forgiveness, for courage in the hour of death. The service ended with hymns rising into the dome, voices breaking with tears. Some kissed the ancient columns, pressing their foreheads against the cool stone as if to hold it in memory. Others embraced strangers, forgiving old feuds in the face of eternity. When the congregation finally spilled out into the night, Hagia Sophia was left in silence, its candles still flickering. Within hours, it would no longer be a church. At dawn, the defenders returned to the walls. The citizens returned to their homes. And Hagia Sophia, that vast heart of Byzantium, waited for its fate. When Ottoman soldiers entered the next day, it would echo not with hymns, but with shouts of conquest. Its mosaics would be plastered over, its altar stripped, its dome crowned with a crescent. But for one night, it had been what it was always meant to be, the soul of a people, gathered in defiance of death. The last liturgy in Hagia Sophia matters because it was more than a religious ceremony. It was a communal farewell, the final heartbeat of a civilization. It turned centuries of division into a moment of unity, however brief. It gave ordinary people the courage to face the unthinkable. It also explains why the Fall of Constantinople is remembered not just as a military event, but as a cultural and spiritual catastrophe. 1,000 years of history ended not only with broken walls, but with a broken liturgy, the last words of an empire spoken in prayer. On the night of May 28, 1453, Constantinople said goodbye to itself. Under the vast dome of Hagia Sophia, emperor and citizen, Orthodox and Catholic, soldier and child, stood as one. When they left the church, they walked not into safety but into destiny. By the next sunrise, the final assault would begin. And Hagia Sophia, their cathedral, their pride, their last refuge, would belong to another world. The night of May 28th passed in a strange, almost sacred stillness. After weeks of pounding, raiding, and alarms, the Ottoman camp fell quiet. No cannon fire. No assaults. Just the flicker of thousands of torches stretching across the plain. Inside Constantinople, people whispered, "What are they waiting for?" But they knew. The silence was not mercy. It was preparation. Mehmet had ordered the bombardment to cease so his troops could rest, sharpen weapons, pray, and gather their strength. Everyone, from the lowest irregular to the finest janissary, knew what was coming at dawn. And inside the walls, the defenders also knew. They had fought for weeks, patched rubble, prayed for miracles, and watched hope fade. Now they prepared to meet death. The emperor walked the ramparts one last time, thanking soldiers by name, embracing commanders, offering words of courage. Giustiniani's mercenaries tightened armor straps and sharpened blades. Citizens clutched icons, whispering prayers. It was the last night Constantinople would ever know as a Byzantine city. In the hours before dawn, a sound broke the silence, the steady, thunderous beat of Ottoman war drums. Horns blared. Shouts rose from the camp. Fires flared. And then, as the first gray light crept over the horizon, the cannons roared again, shaking the earth, smashing into walls already torn to rubble. The dawn attack had begun. Mehmet's plan was coldly methodical. First, he sent in the irregulars, thousands of poorly armed men, Anatolian peasants, adventurers, mercenaries, expendable bodies meant to tire the defenders and fill the moats with their corpses. They surged forward shouting, ladders on their shoulders, arrows flying. Defenders rained missiles down stones, javelins, boiling water, even household objects hurled by desperate civilians. The irregulars fell by the hundreds, trampled, cut down, pierced with arrows. The walls held. But Mehmet had not expected them to break through. Their task was to soften, to exhaust, to bleed the defenders' strength. And they did. As the first wave retreated in chaos, the second surged forward, Anatolian soldiers, better armed, more disciplined. They attacked the same breaches, climbing over the bodies of the dead. Now the fighting grew fiercer. Steel clashed. Defenders fought hand-to-hand on the walls, shoving ladders back, stabbing down with spears, grappling with men who tried to climb over. Arrows darkened the sky. The roar of battle filled every street near the walls. For a time, the defenders held again. But their arms grew heavy. Their numbers dwindled. And Mehmet's plan pressed forward. At last, Mehmet unleashed his finest. The Janissaries advanced in perfect order, shields locked, banners high, voices chanting. They did not rush. They marched like a machine, steady and terrifying, their discipline a stark contrast to the chaos of the earlier waves. This was the hammer meant to crush the defenders for good. At the main breach near the gate of St. Romanus, the Janissaries pressed hardest. Giustiniani and his Genoese mercenaries met them with equal ferocity. For hours, the two elites clashed in brutal combat, pike against sword, shield against shield, neither side yielding an inch. Constantine XI himself fought alongside them, sword in hand, shouting encouragement, striking down foes, refusing to retreat. The battle was chaos beyond imagining. Cannons boomed, hurling dust and stone into the air. Smoke drifted over the walls, choking soldiers. Arrows rained down like deadly hail. The cries of the wounded and the clash of steel merged into a single unending roar. Imagine standing there, the ground trembling, your arms numb from striking, your ears deaf from cannon fire, your lungs raw from smoke, and knowing there was no end but death. Despite their valor, the defenders faced an impossible task. The breaches were too wide, the rubble too loose, the numbers too overwhelming. Every time they pushed the Janissaries back, more surged forward. Every time they filled a gap, another cannon shot tore it open again. The defenders fought like lions, but they were outnumbered 20-1. Then came the blow that broke the city's last line of strength. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese captain, was struck by a cannon fragment or crossbow bolt. Accounts differ, and gravely wounded. He was carried from the walls, bleeding, begging for aid. His mercenaries, seeing their leader gone, began to falter. Panic rippled through their ranks. And without them, the weakest section of the defenses stood exposed. Constantine begged Giustiniani to stay, but pain overcame loyalty. The Genoese withdrew, and with them went the last disciplined bulwark. The Janissaries surged forward through the breach. Ladders went up. Men poured over rubble. Defenders fell back, fighting desperately but chaotically. Some gates were forced open. Others collapsed under sheer pressure. Soon, Ottoman banners rose above the walls. Trumpets blared. Shouts of triumph echoed. After 7 weeks of siege and 1,000 years of defiance, the walls of Constantinople had finally been broken. Inside the city, Constantine XI threw himself into the chaos. Stripping away his imperial regalia so no one could distinguish him from an ordinary soldier, he charged into the melee at the gate of St. Romanus. Chroniclers say his last words were, "The city is lost, but I live." Then he vanished into the crush of battle, never to be seen again. Some say his body was never found, that he was buried under corpses, that perhaps, as legend held, he was turned into marble by an angel, waiting to rise again. Whatever the truth, the last emperor of Rome died as he had vowed, with a sword in his hand, on the walls of his city. The dawn attack of May 29, 1453, was more than a battle. It was the collision of worlds. The old, crumbling walls, exhausted defenders, a fading empire, against the new gunpowder, discipline, relentless ambition. It mattered because it was the moment when the inevitable became real. No more rumors, no more hopes, no more prayers. Only the thunder of cannons, the march of Janissaries, and the blood of the last Romans spilled on their walls. By mid-morning, the Ottomans had stormed through the breaches. The emperor was dead. The Genoese had fled. The defenders were scattered or slain. Constantinople, queen of cities, had fallen. And yet, the horror had only begun. For 3 days, the city would endure looting, fire, and slaughter. Hagia Sophia, where the faithful had gathered the night before, would be filled not with hymns but with captives and conquerors. The dawn attack had broken the walls. What came next would break the city itself. For 7 weeks, Constantinople had defied the impossible. With crumbling walls, dwindling food, and only a few thousand defenders, the city had stood against the might of Mehmet II's empire. But on the morning of May 29th, 1453, when the Janissaries poured through the breaches and Ottoman banners rose above the Theodosian walls, the fragile thread of resistance finally snapped. The fall of the walls was not the end in itself. It was the spark. The true breaking point came when panic spread inside the city, when organized defense turned into chaos, when soldiers threw down weapons, when civilians ran screaming through the streets. It was the moment a city ceased to be a city and became only a ruin waiting to be plundered. At the gate of St. Romanus, Constantine XI had made his final stand. His sword rose and fell until he was swallowed by the flood of Janissaries. When word spread that the emperor was dead, hope crumbled with him. To many, his death was the symbolic death of the empire itself. Without an emperor, without leadership, there was no state, only terrified individuals fighting for their own lives. Some fought on, determined to take as many enemies with them as possible. Others simply dropped their weapons and fled. The thin thread of unity that had held the city together broke in an instant. The Genoese mercenaries under Giovanni Giustiniani had been the backbone of the defense. But when their captain was gravely wounded and carried from the walls, their discipline collapsed. Many withdrew to their ships, hoping to escape by sea. For the Byzantines watching from the battlements, the sight was devastating. Allies they had counted on, who had fought bravely for weeks, now vanished when they were needed most. Blame and bitterness filled the air, but there was no time for recriminations. The walls were open, and the enemy was inside. As news of the breaches spread, panic swept through the city. Church bells rang wildly, not as calls to prayer but as alarms. Crowds surged through narrow streets, some running toward the harbor in hope of escape, others toward Hagia Sophia, believing they would find sanctuary there. Mothers clutched children, dragging them by the hand. Old men stumbled, muttering prayers. Merchants tried to carry valuables on their backs. Horses bolted riderless. The air filled with screams, the crash of doors splintering, the roar of fire. What had once been the capital of empire was now a swarm of terrified humanity, each person driven by instinct to flee, hide, or surrender. At the harbor, chaos reigned. Some tried to lower boats into the water, only to be trampled by crowds. Others swam desperately, weighed down by armor or clothing, vanishing beneath the waves. A few Genoese ships managed to escape, carrying survivors to the safety of Galata across the Golden Horn. But most were trapped, hemmed in by the Ottoman fleet. The sea gates, once guarded by proud walls, now became bottlenecks of death. People clawed over each other to reach them, only to find Ottoman soldiers already flooding in from the other side. Inside Hagia Sophia, thousands gathered for what they believed would be salvation. Families, priests, monks, nuns, merchants, all crammed into the great cathedral, clutching icons and relics. They sang hymns, their voices trembling, praying for a miracle, for angels to descend, for the Virgin to save them, for God to intervene as he had in ages past. But the miracle never came. Ottoman soldiers would soon burst through its doors, turning the holiest sanctuary of Christendom into a place of captivity. Not everyone fled. Pockets of defenders fought on in the streets, rallying around broken barricades, ambushing invaders in alleys, cutting down Janissaries before being cut down themselves. Some fought out of duty, others out of rage, others simply because they had no choice. These last stands slowed the Ottomans, but could not stop them. The tide was too great. The defenders were too few. By mid-morning, organized resistance had collapsed everywhere. Once inside, the Ottomans poured through the city like a flood. Soldiers spread in every direction, seizing towers, breaking into homes, cutting down anyone who resisted. Trumpets blared, drums thundered, and shouts of triumph echoed through streets once filled with Greek and Latin voices. To the conquerors, it was the fulfillment of prophecy. To the conquered, it was the end of the world. The breaking point wasn't simply military. It was psychological. Panic transformed what might have been a more orderly surrender into chaos. Families were separated. Children lost in the crowd. People trampled at the gates. others hid in cellars, only to be dragged out hours later. The collapse of order meant the city was defenseless not only to the army outside, but to the terror inside. The breaking point of Constantinople matters because it shows how cities fall not only to walls being breached, but to human fear. A single stone wall collapsing is not enough to end a civilization, but the panic that spreads when people realize the wall is gone can do it in minutes. It also marks the true end of the Byzantine Empire. The emperor's death, the mercenaries' flight, the citizens' panic, together they show that what had once been Rome's proudest heir was now only fragments, scattered and powerless before the storm. By noon on May 29th, the city was no longer in Byzantine hands. The Ottomans controlled the walls, the gates, the harbor. Resistance had become scattered, hopeless pockets of violence. Civilians huddled in Hagia Sophia. Soldiers lay dead in the streets. Fires spread unchecked. The Queen of Cities, once the pride of empire, had reached her breaking point. And Mehmet too, the young sultan who had dreamed of this moment since boyhood, prepared to claim his prize. Every empire ends with a final figure, a last torchbearer who refuses to let the flame go out quietly. For Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire that had endured for over 1,000 years, that figure was Constantine XI Palaiologos. On the morning of May 29, 1453, as the walls collapsed and the Janissaries surged into the city, Constantine faced a choice that would define not only his own fate, but the memory of his empire. And he chose, as emperors of Rome had sworn to do, to fight to the last breath, to die with his city. Constantine XI had inherited a crumbling empire. His realm was little more than Constantinople itself and a few scraps of territory. His treasury was empty, his army small, his people divided by bitter theological feuds. Yet he bore the weight of Rome's legacy on his shoulders. He wasn't a great conqueror or lawgiver like Justinian, nor a philosopher-emperor like Marcus Aurelius. He was something rarer, a ruler who stood at the end and refused to abandon dignity when all else was lost. That morning, Constantine rode to the weakest point of the defenses, the great breach near the gate of St. Romanus. Justiniani's Genoese mercenaries, who had fought bravely for weeks, were faltering after their captain's wounding. The Janissaries pressed forward, disciplined and relentless. The walls gaped wide. The emperor dismounted, sword in hand, and joined the line. Chroniclers say he tore off the imperial purple, declaring, "The city is lost, but I live." Stripped of regalia, he became simply another soldier among his people. Imagine the sight, the last emperor of Rome, his face smeared with dust and sweat, standing shoulder to shoulder with fishermen, craftsmen, priests, and mercenaries. No throne, no court, no pomp. Only a sword and the will to die with honor. Some sources claim that before the final assault, Constantine addressed his men. His words, though varied in the chronicles, echo the same theme. Men of Constantinople, we have reached the final hour. The enemy is upon us. Surrender is not for us. Let us die defending our faith, our families, our city. I thank you for your loyalty. I ask forgiveness for my failings. And I promise you, today I die with you. Whether the exact words are true or not, the sentiment lived in his actions. He did not flee to a ship. He did not surrender to Mehmet. He chose to share the fate of his people. When the Janissaries surged through the breach, Constantine rushed to meet them. His sword flashed in the dust and smoke, cutting down enemies in a frenzy of desperation. Witnesses claimed he fought like a man possessed, striking down 2, 3, perhaps more before the tide swallowed him. Around him, loyal companions fought to the death. Nobles of the Palaiologos family. Captains of the guard. Priests who had picked up swords. One by one, they fell. Constantine pressed deeper into the melee, shouting, fighting, refusing to yield. And then he was gone. No one ever found Constantine's body with certainty. Some claimed his corpse was discovered under a pile of slain soldiers, recognized only by the imperial shoes he wore. Others insisted his remains were desecrated, his head cut off and paraded before Mehmet. Still others clung to the legend that an angel turned him into marble at the moment of death, hiding him beneath the Golden Gate to await the day when Constantinople would be restored. The truth remains a mystery, but perhaps that is fitting. For an emperor who stood at the crossroads of history, half man and half legend, a death without a body left him larger than life. Even Mehmet II, conqueror of the city, is said to have admired Constantine's end. The young sultan who dreamed of empire knew what it meant to face death with such defiance. While he celebrated his triumph, he also honored the fallen emperor as a worthy foe. To Mehmet, Constantine's stand confirmed the greatness of the prize he had taken. An empire whose last ruler died sword in hand was an empire worthy of conquest. Constantine's last stand became more than history. It became a myth, a symbol carried in Greek hearts for centuries. For those who mourned Byzantium, he was the hero who had refused surrender. For Orthodox Christians, he was almost a saint, a martyr emperor who died defending faith and city. For poets and storytellers, he was the marble emperor, not dead but sleeping beneath the earth, waiting to rise again. Even today, in modern Greece, statues of Constantine XI stand with sword in hand, a reminder that though the empire fell, its last ruler did not abandon his duty. Constantine's last stand matters because it shows that, even at the end of an empire, dignity can survive. He had no chance of victory, no hope of survival. Yet he chose to die fighting, and in doing so, he gave his people a final gift: the knowledge that their emperor did not abandon them. It also mattered because it closed a circle of history. From Augustus to Constantine the Great, emperors had claimed to be Rome's guardians. Constantine XI was the last to bear that mantle, and he bore it not in triumph, but in sacrifice. By mid-morning of May 29th, the emperor was dead, the walls overrun, the city collapsing. With Constantine's fall, Byzantium ceased to exist. The Roman Empire, born over 1,000 years before in the west and carried on in the east, was finally gone. But his stand ensured that its memory would not die quietly. His sword stroke echoed across centuries, a defiance remembered long after the cannons fell silent. The Theodosian walls had stood for over 1,000 years. They had withstood Persians, Arabs, Rus, Crusaders, and countless would-be conquerors. Generations of Byzantines believed they were eternal, a bulwark raised by God himself. But on May 29, 1453, as the sun climbed above the horizon, that illusion crumbled. The fall of Constantinople was not a single blow, but the culmination of weeks of pounding artillery, desperate repairs, and relentless assaults. Yet when the walls finally broke, it felt like a world ending in a single morning. At the gate of St. Romanus, the breaches gaped wider than any defense could fill. What had once been triple lines of stone towers and curtain walls was now rubble, mounds of broken masonry spilling into ditches filled with bodies. The Ottomans surged forward with ladders and shields, their drums and horns shaking the air. Behind them, cannons fired still, blasting apart what remained of the towers. Every shot widened the openings, sending defenders sprawling. The Byzantines, exhausted from weeks of labor, could not keep pace. They had patched the breaches with earth, barrels, and timber, but now those makeshift repairs splintered like twigs. The walls, those proud, towering symbols of 1,000 years, were no longer walls at all. They were wounds, wide open, bleeding defenders. Once the Janissaries entered the main breach, the fall became unstoppable. They surged through in disciplined ranks, cutting down defenders with sword and spear. Behind them came waves of Anatolian soldiers, eager for plunder. Soon, multiple breaches were open. The walls that had once formed a shield around Constantinople now became funnels, pouring invaders into the city. The defenders fought in pockets, rallying behind fallen towers, counterattacking in alleys. But their unity was gone. With Giustiniani's Genoese mercenaries withdrawing, with the emperor fallen in the melee, with civilians screaming in the streets, resistance became scattered and frantic. It was no longer a defense. It was drowning. As the Ottomans poured over the battlements, they tore down Byzantine banners and raised their own. The double-headed eagle of the Palaiologos dynasty, once the emblem of empire, was ripped away, replaced by the green banners of Islam. From tower to tower, crescent banners rose in the morning light. For those watching from within the city, each new banner was a dagger to the heart, proof that their walls, their pride, their history, had been stripped from them. The moat before the walls, once a barrier, now became a grave. Filled with corpses of earlier assaults, it was trampled underfoot by fresh waves of attackers. Defenders stumbled over bodies, slipping in blood and mud. The stench was overwhelming, the cries unearthly. What had begun as a defense line had turned into a charnel pit, feeding the momentum of the attackers. Inside the city, alarms rang wildly. Bells tolled, not for prayer but in desperation. Messengers shouted warnings as gates fell, towers surrendered, breaches widened. Panic spread faster than news. In some places, defenders still fought fiercely, unaware that other sections had already fallen. In others, men dropped weapons and fled. Civilians clogged streets, running for Hagia Sophia or the harbor. Constantinople had ceased to be a fortress. It was now a city in chaos. For the Ottomans, the moment was overwhelming. After weeks of siege, after losses and frustration, the prize lay open before them. Soldiers poured through with fury and exhilaration. Drums thundered louder. Shouts of Allahu Akbar rolled over the city like thunder. What had once been impregnable was theirs. The city of Constantine, the second Rome, had fallen. Still, not all gave up. Small groups of defenders fought to the death in ruined towers and courtyards. Priests stood with swords in hand. Women threw stones from rooftops. Children ran messages between barricades. But it was hopeless. The sheer scale of the assault, tens of thousands of soldiers flooding in through breaches that stretched the length of football fields, was too much. One by one, these last redoubts were crushed. The fall of the walls was not only military. It was symbolic. For centuries, Constantinople had been defined by those walls. They were the line between East and West, Christianity and Islam, Rome and its enemies. To see them broken was to see the myth of invincibility destroyed. It marked the end of an era, the age of stone fortresses. Gunpowder had proven that even the mightiest walls could fall. The world of antiquity, preserved in Byzantine mortar, had finally given way to the modern age. By mid-morning, the Ottomans controlled the battlements and gates. The walls of Constantinople, the pride of Justinian, the shield of Christendom, no longer belonged to Byzantium. Through those shattered openings, the conquerors poured into the city. And with them came not only soldiers, but the future. The Queen of Cities had fallen. The fall of the walls matters because it was the true end of Constantinople's defense. The emperor's courage, the people's prayers, the mercenaries' valor, all crumbled once the breaches were too wide to mend. It mattered because it was not just a physical defeat, but a psychological one. An empire that had defined itself by endurance, by survival against impossible odds, was undone when its greatest symbol, its walls, finally failed. By the late morning of May 29, 1453, the Ottomans were inside the city in force. The walls had fallen, the gates were open, and the banner of Byzantium had been torn down. What remained was not defense, but aftermath, the sack of Constantinople, the terror of its people, and the triumphant entry of Mehmet II into his prize. The Roman Empire, in all its long, stubborn survival, was gone. When the walls of Constantinople fell on May 29, 1453, the city's story did not end in an instant. What followed was 3 days that seared themselves into memory, days of chaos, terror, blood, and destruction. For centuries, the Byzantines had prayed that God would protect their city. Instead, they faced what countless other cities in history had endured, the ancient right of conquerors to plunder. Mehmet II, like many rulers before him, promised his soldiers the traditional reward of 3 days free looting. For an army that had bled for 7 weeks under the walls, this was their prize. For the people of Constantinople, it was a nightmare. As Ottoman soldiers poured through the breaches, discipline gave way to frenzy. Thousands fanned out through the city, breaking into houses, shops, monasteries, and palaces. Doors were smashed. Locks splintered. Streets filled with shouting, trampling feet, and the clash of steel as soldiers cut down anyone who resisted. Merchant stores were stripped bare, silks, spices, jewelry, gold coins. Nobles' homes were ransacked, furniture overturned, treasures stuffed into sacks. Fires ignited, sending smoke curling into the sky. For ordinary citizens, there was no escape. Soldiers dragged men, women, and children into the streets, striking them, binding them, driving them like herds toward the camps outside the city. Death and slavery walked side by side. Those who resisted were slaughtered outright. Others were bound in chains, destined for the slave markets of Edirne, Bursa, or further still. Families were torn apart, fathers separated from wives and children, sons dragged one way, daughters another. The sound of weeping filled the streets as people were driven from their homes. Some clung to altars in churches, refusing to let go until they were pried loose by soldiers' hands. Others hid in cellars, only to be discovered hours later, hauled out like animals. Byzantium, the empire that had once ruled the Mediterranean, was reduced in a single morning to captives and corpses. The most haunting scene unfolded at Hagia Sophia. Thousands had crowded into the great cathedral the night before, believing it a sanctuary. Families knelt together, chanting hymns, hoping for divine intervention. When Ottoman soldiers burst through the doors, the sanctuary became a trap. People screamed, priests tried to shield their flocks, mothers held infants to their chests. The vast dome that had echoed with prayers now echoed with terror. Some were killed outright at the altar. Others were chained and dragged away. The icons, chalices, and relics that had been venerated for centuries were seized as booty. Within hours, the holiest church of Christendom had been stripped of its sanctity. Though Mehmet had not ordered the city burned, fires spread as looters set houses alight, either carelessly or deliberately. Entire neighborhoods went up in flames. The smoke mingled with cannon dust, turning daylight into a choking haze. Byzantine chroniclers described the city as a vision of hell, streets filled with smoke, corpses, and the cries of the enslaved. Once proud boulevards lined with colonnades and palaces were reduced to ash and rubble. The Byzantine aristocracy suffered no less than commoners. Palaces were stormed, treasures seized, noble women carried off as captives. Members of the Senate, once the rulers of empire, were dragged through the streets in chains. The Palaiologos dynasty itself ended in fire and blood. Some relatives of Constantine XI were captured, others vanished in the chaos. The line of emperors that had stretched back to Augustus was extinguished in slavery and obscurity. A few pockets of resistance remained in the city, but they were quickly crushed. Priests who took up arms were cut down. Soldiers who barricaded streets were overwhelmed. By the afternoon of May 29th, organized defense had ceased. Constantinople, which had resisted so fiercely for 7 weeks, now lay utterly broken. Outside the city walls, the Ottomans established makeshift slave markets. Captives were divided and distributed. Young boys and girls fetched the highest prices. Skilled artisans were claimed for the Sultan's service. Others were sold in bulk, herded like cattle. For the people of Constantinople, it was the cruelest humiliation, from citizens of the Queen of Cities to property bought and sold in open air. On the afternoon of May 29th, Mehmet too entered the city. Riding through the shattered gates, he surveyed the ruin. He rode straight to Hagia Sophia, dismounted, and ordered it to be cleansed and converted into a mosque. For the conqueror, it was triumph, the fulfillment of prophecy, the crowning achievement of his reign. For the survivors, it was the sealing of loss. Their city was no longer theirs. True to tradition, the sack lasted 3 days. On the 3rd day, Mehmet ordered it stopped. He declared that the city now belonged to him, that its people were his subjects, and that further destruction would harm his prize. But the damage was already done. Tens of thousands were dead or enslaved. Churches desecrated, treasures looted, homes destroyed. Constantinople, once the jewel of the Mediterranean, lay gutted. The 3 days of horror matter because they marked not only the fall of a city, but the death of a civilization. For the Byzantines, it was not just military defeat. It was humiliation, desecration, and despair. Their holiest sites defiled, their families torn apart, their emperor dead, the empire ended not with dignity but with chaos. And yet, it was also the birth of something new. For Mehmet, the sack was the ritual ending of Byzantium and the beginning of Ottoman Constantinople, soon to be Istanbul, capital of a new world empire. By June 1st, the sack was over. The city was silent, broken, smoldering. Hagia Sophia was now a mosque. Survivors cowered in ruins or captivity. And Mehmet too, just 21 years old, sat enthroned in the palace of the Caesars. The Byzantine Empire was no more. The Roman Empire, which had endured in one form or another for over 1,500 years, had come to its end. And the world had changed forever. On May 29, 1453, as the dust and smoke of conquest still hung over the ruins of Constantinople, a 21-year-old sultan entered the city that would define his name forever. He had dreamed of this moment since boyhood, studied for it with the discipline of a scholar and the ruthlessness of a general, and now stood at the center of history's turning point. From that day on, Mehmet II would be remembered by a single title, Fatih, the Conqueror. Riding through the shattered gate of St. Romanus, Mehmet surveyed the wreckage. Bodies littered the streets. Fires smoldered. Captives were herded in chains. But the young sultan's eyes were fixed not on destruction, but on possession. He ordered his troops to halt their slaughter. The 3 days of plunder had ended. Now the city was his, and he wanted it whole. Mehmet rode to Hagia Sophia, the heart of the fallen empire. Dismounting at its steps, he entered the vast cathedral, still echoing with the sobs of captives. He ordered a muezzin to climb into the pulpit and proclaim the Shahada, the declaration of Islamic faith. In that instant, Hagia Sophia ceased to be a church. It became a mosque. For Byzantines, it was desecration. For Mehmet, it was destiny fulfilled. What set Mehmet apart from other conquerors was not just that he took Constantinople, it was what he claimed it meant. To him, this was not simply an Ottoman victory. It was the inheritance of Rome. He declared himself Kaiser Rum, Caesar of Rome. In his mind, the line of emperors that had stretched from Augustus to Constantine the Great to Constantine XI now passed to him. He was not destroying empire. He was continuing it under new rule. To many Europeans, the claim was outrageous. To Mehmet, it was obvious. He had the city, the walls, the throne. The empire belonged to whoever could hold it. And he held it. When Mehmet entered Constantinople, it was not the jewel of old. Centuries of decline and the sack of 1204 had left it a shadow of itself. The siege and looting reduced it further, broken walls, burned houses, empty streets. But Mehmet saw potential, not decay. He ordered immediate rebuilding. Mosques rose from the shells of churches. Palaces were repaired. Markets reopened. He invited merchants, artisans, and scholars to repopulate the city, offering tax breaks and privileges. Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike were encouraged to settle, reviving Constantinople as a capital of diversity and wealth. Within a generation, it was transformed no longer Byzantium, but Istanbul, heart of the Ottoman Empire. Mehmet was not content with mere conquest. He envisioned an empire that stretched across continents. Constantinople, sitting at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, became his launching point. He strengthened the navy, expanded east into Anatolia, pressed north into the Balkans, and dreamed even of conquering Italy. His ambition was boundless, fueled by the same confidence that had driven him to haul ships over land and batter down the walls of Constantinople. But above all, he wanted his capital to be a city worthy of empire. He rebuilt the palace complex, patronized scholars and artists, and made Istanbul the cultural and political heart of his world. In claiming the mantle of Rome, Mehmet forced Europe to reckon with him not just as a sultan, but as an emperor. To some in the West, it was blasphemy. How could a Muslim call himself Caesar? To others, it was undeniable. Constantinople had fallen, and Rome's heir now wore a turban. The irony was sharp. For centuries, Western rulers had dismissed Byzantines as Greeks, not true Romans. Now, when the title of Roman emperor passed to Mehmet, they suddenly insisted it still belonged in the West. But history is rarely about claims. It is about power. And in 1453, power sat firmly in Mehmet's hands. Despite the Sacs' brutality, Mehmet did not intend to leave Constantinople a wasteland. He needed it alive. He freed some captives, restored churches to Christian communities, and even appointed a new patriarch of Constantinople to lead the Orthodox Church under Ottoman protection. This was calculated mercy, not sentiment. By preserving the church, Mehmet ensured the loyalty of Orthodox subjects across his empire. By repopulating the city, he guaranteed its wealth. His genius was not only in conquest, but in consolidation. With Constantinople in his hands, Mehmet too reshaped the map. The fall of the city closed the last chapter of the Middle Ages and opened the early modern world. Trade routes shifted, scholars fled to Italy carrying Greek manuscripts, fueling the Renaissance. Europe trembled at the thought of Ottoman armies marching westward. For his empire, the conquest became the foundation of greatness. Istanbul was no longer the ghost of Byzantium, it was the living heart of Ottoman power. Mehmet the Conqueror matters because he turned victory into an empire. Many had tried to take Constantinople. Only he succeeded. But more importantly, he knew how to use that success, to claim legitimacy, to rebuild, to project power beyond the city's walls. He was not just a destroyer. He was a builder, a visionary, a man who fused sword and pen, conquest and governance. His reign proved that empires are not born only in blood, they are cemented in vision. By the summer of 1453, Constantinople was no longer Constantinople. It was Istanbul, the capital of a new empire, the jewel of Mehmet's crown. The Byzantine dream was gone, but the Ottoman dream had only begun. The conqueror had claimed his city, his title, and his place in history. And the world would never be the same. When news of Constantinople's fall spread across the world in the summer of 1453, it was like an earthquake felt on every shore. For the Ottomans, it was triumph. For the Christian world, it was catastrophe. For others, it was a sign that the map of the world itself had changed. Few events in history reverberated so loudly, reshaping politics, religion, culture, and imagination all at once. For Mehmet II and his empire, the conquest was more than military success. It was the fulfillment of prophecy. Muslim chroniclers had long cited the hadith, "One day, Constantinople shall be conquered. Blessed is the commander who conquers it, blessed are his soldiers." When the city fell, Ottoman preachers proclaimed Mehmet as that blessed commander. He became Fatih Sultan Mehmet, Mehmet the Conqueror, a figure chosen by God to accomplish what generations had failed to do. Festivals erupted across Ottoman lands. Cities lit bonfires, poets wrote verses, scholars praised the Sultan as the new Alexander, the new Caesar. The fall of Constantinople was not just a victory, it was a civilizational turning point, a moment when Muslims could say they had surpassed both East and West. For the Byzantine Greeks, there were no celebrations, only mourning. Refugees scattered across the Aegean and into Italy, carrying with them stories of horror and loss. Monks wept over the fall of Hagia Sophia. Priests whispered that the sins of the people, pride, greed, disunity, had brought divine punishment. Legends sprang up almost immediately of Constantine XI turned to marble by an angel, sleeping beneath the Golden Gate until God would awaken him. These stories were not mere fantasy, they were survival. A way for Greeks to hold on to hope even when their empire was gone. The fall was not only political but existential. Byzantium had been the Eastern Roman Empire, the heir of Caesar and Constantine. Now, that identity was shattered. What remained was memory, longing, and faith. When word reached the courts of Europe, the reaction was immediate and visceral, disbelief, then dread. In Rome, Pope Nicholas V reportedly wept when the news arrived. The city that had once been Christendom's shield was gone. Priests thundered from pulpits that the apocalypse was near. Pamphlets circulated calling for crusade, but no army materialized. In Venice, the reaction was more practical: panic over trade. Venetian merchants had long relied on Constantinople as a hub to the Black Sea. Now that the Ottomans held it, Venetian wealth seemed suddenly fragile. The Senate debated war but hesitated, calculating costs. In Hungary and the Balkans, rulers braced for invasion. They knew the Ottoman tide would not stop at Constantinople. Fortresses were reinforced, alliances discussed, but fear outweighed action. In France and England, still reeling from the Hundred Years' War, the news landed like a distant thunderclap, frightening but far away. Kings made speeches, promised prayers, but sent no fleets. For Europeans, the fall was not only strategic but symbolic. Constantinople had been the queen of cities, the bulwark of Christianity in the East. Its fall felt like a wound to Christendom itself. Chroniclers describe people trembling, convinced the end times were near. Sermons rang with apocalyptic imagery, the beast rising, the fall of Babylon, the wrath of God. And yet, alongside fear came something else: resolve. If Constantinople could fall, then Europe had to unite or perish. The seeds of later coalitions against the Ottomans at Lepanto at Vienna were planted in the ashes of 1453. Ironically, even as Italians mourned the fall, they benefited from it. Refugee scholars fled Byzantium carrying manuscripts of Greek philosophy, science, and literature. Works of Plato, Aristotle, and countless others poured into Italy, fueling the Renaissance. Florence, Venice, Rome all became centers of rediscovered classical knowledge, enriched by the very collapse of the empire that had preserved it. The fall of Constantinople thus became both a tragedy and a strange gift, a transfer of wisdom from east to west that helped ignite Europe's rebirth. Far to the north, the fall of Constantinople was interpreted in a startling way. Moscow's rulers, married into Byzantine dynasties and eager for legitimacy, began to declare themselves heirs of Byzantium. If the first Rome had fallen and the second Rome, Constantinople, had fallen, then Moscow would be the third Rome, the last protector of orthodoxy. This idea would shape Russian identity for centuries, born directly from the shock of 1453. In Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad, the fall was hailed as a victory for Islam as a whole. The Mamluks of Egypt, rivals of the Ottomans, nonetheless sent congratulations. Poets across the Middle East wrote in praise of Mehmet's triumph. But there was also unease. If the Ottomans could take Constantinople, what might they take next? Mehmet's ambition unsettled allies as much as enemies. In Persia, India, and even China, the fall was noted but distant. Envoys carried news along trade routes. Chroniclers recorded it with interest, as proof of Ottoman strength. For some, it was a reminder of how power was shifting westward toward a rising empire that might soon shape the whole world. The world's reaction to Constantinople's fall matters because it shows how one city could be the hinge of global history. To the Ottomans, it was a triumph. To Europe, it was trauma. To Italy, it was an unexpected spark. To Russia, it was inheritance. To the Islamic world, it was glory. Few events ripple so widely, reshaping identities, economies, religions, and imaginations. The fall of Constantinople was not just the end of Byzantium. It was the beginning of a new world order. By the end of 1453, everyone knew history had turned a page. The Roman Empire, in its eastern form, was gone. The Ottoman Empire now stood in its place, bold and rising. And across Europe and beyond, people whispered the same thought: nothing would ever be the same again. Empires collapse, but their memories linger like ghosts. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the Byzantine Empire ceased to exist, but its people carried the weight of loss for centuries. They kept the city alive in legend, in liturgy, in lullabies whispered to children who would never see its walls. For Greeks, for Orthodox Christians, and even for the wider world, the fall of Constantinople became more than an event. It became a wound that never fully healed, and a symbol that still endures. In the weeks after the fall, survivors fled across the Aegean. Some made their way to Crete, Rhodes, or Cyprus. Others landed in Italy, finding refuge in Venice, Genoa, and Florence. They carried little with them, a few possessions, manuscripts, sometimes only the clothes on their backs. Among them were scholars, priests, artisans, and nobles. These exiles became living testaments of Byzantium. In Italian courts, they told stories of the siege, wept for their emperor, and taught their children to remember the city they had lost. For Western patrons, they offered knowledge, Greek manuscripts, learning, traditions, but beneath their teaching lay grief. For Orthodox Christians, the fall of Constantinople was more than political. It was spiritual. Hagia Sophia, once the center of their world, had become a mosque. Their patriarch was now appointed under Ottoman rule. Yet the church endured. Liturgies continued. Icons still glowed in candlelight. And the memory of 1453 became a theme in prayers, the lament of a people who had lost their holy city but not their faith. Songs emerged, mournful laments called threnoi, mourning the fall as if mourning a loved one. One popular dirge spoke of Hagia Sophia still waiting, its doors closed by angels until the day it would be restored. For centuries, these laments kept the memory alive, whispered in villages and sung in monasteries. The city was gone, but in faith it endured. One of the most enduring legends was the tale of the Marble Emperor. According to this story, Constantine XI did not die on the walls. At the last moment, an angel took him, turned him to marble, and hid him beneath the golden gate of Constantinople. There he sleeps, sword in hand, waiting for the day when God will wake him to lead his people to victory and reclaim the city. For Greeks under Ottoman rule, this myth was hope disguised as prophecy. It allowed them to believe that their empire was not dead, only sleeping. That their emperor had not fallen, only hidden. That one day, Constantinople would be theirs again. Generations of Greek children grew up hearing lullabies about the fall. Mothers sang of Hagia Sophia weeping, of saints mourning, of angels sealing the doors. The songs were not only laments, but lessons, teaching the young to remember, to long, to dream. Imagine growing up centuries later in a mountain village under Ottoman rule and still hearing your mother whisper of Constantinople as if it had fallen yesterday. That was the legacy of loss, not history in books, but memory in blood. Exiled Byzantine scholars carried manuscripts of Plato, Aristotle, and countless others into Italy. These works, copied and studied, helped ignite the Renaissance. So while Byzantium died, its intellectual seed gave birth to a new flowering in the West. Ironically, the empire that had struggled to survive in isolation gave the world its rebirth in art, philosophy, and science. This too was a legacy of loss, destruction feeding creation, collapse fueling renewal. For Orthodox Christians outside the Ottoman Empire, in Russia, in the Balkans, in distant lands, the fall became a rallying cry. Moscow declared itself the Third Rome, heir to Constantinople. Serbian and Bulgarian traditions mourn the fall as their own, seeing it as part of a larger story of Christians suffering under Ottoman power. In this way, Constantinople's memory shaped politics far beyond its walls, fueling identities that would last long after 1453. In Western Europe, the fall became a cautionary tale. Priests used it to warn against disunity. See what happens when Christians quarrel? The Turks advance. Politicians used it to argue for crusades, alliances, and unity against the Ottoman threat. Even centuries later, when European powers fought the Ottomans at Lepanto or Vienna, they invoked the memory of Constantinople as a reminder of what had been lost and what must not be lost again. For the Greek people, the memory of 1453 lasted through centuries of Ottoman rule. Every year, May 29th was remembered with sorrow. Poems and hymns recalled the emperor's death, the loss of Hagia Sophia, the silence of the bells. Even when hope seemed impossible, memory kept the wound fresh. The empire might be gone, but its ghost walked in every village, every church, every prayer. The legacy of loss matters because it shows how history does not end with events. It lives on in memory, in myth, in faith, in identity. Constantinople's fall was not just a single morning in 1453. It was centuries of mourning, of whispered songs, of legends that kept a dead empire alive in the hearts of its people. It mattered because it shaped not only Greek and Orthodox identity, but also the Renaissance in the West, the rise of Moscow, and the sense of urgency in Europe. A city's fall reshaped the world not only in politics, but in memory. By the end of the 15th century, Constantinople was firmly Ottoman, rebuilt, renamed, renewed. But in the hearts of those who had lost it, the city still lived. They carried it in songs, in myths, in dreams of return. And that longing, the legacy of loss, would endure far longer than the empire itself. When Mehmet II entered Constantinople on May 29, 1453, he found not the jewel of his dreams but a broken shell. The walls were shattered, the streets littered with corpses, entire districts burned or abandoned. Decades of decline before the siege had already thinned its population. The sack finished the ruin. And yet, Mehmet saw not rubble but opportunity. Where others saw a corpse, he saw the seed of a future. He would not leave Constantinople a ruin. He would raise it anew as his capital, his legacy, his city. It would no longer be Constantinople, but Istanbul, the heart of the Ottoman world. Mehmet was only 21 when he took the city, but he possessed a vision far beyond his years. For him, conquest was only the beginning. The true work was turning ruin into an empire. He understood what many conquerors failed to grasp. A city cannot serve as a capital if it is left empty, terrified, and burned. It must be rebuilt, repopulated, and reimagined. And that is exactly what Mehmet set out to do. The first challenge was people. After the siege and sack, Constantinople's population had collapsed. Many were dead, enslaved, or fled. What remained was a husk, great avenues silent, houses abandoned, markets deserted. Mehmet issued orders to repopulate the city. He brought in Muslims from Anatolia, Greeks from the countryside, Armenians, Jews, and even Slavs. Communities were resettled by decree, sometimes forcibly, sometimes with incentives. Within a generation, the city began to hum with life again, not the Byzantine city of old, but a new, diverse Istanbul. Mehmet prioritized reconstruction. The walls were repaired, gates fortified. The old Byzantine palaces were restored, but he also built new ones. The Topkapi Palace, overlooking the Bosphorus, became the new seat of power. Markets were re-established, roads cleared, aqueducts repaired. Slowly, the city shifted from ruin to renewal, its bones strengthened under new hands. No transformation was more symbolic than Hagia Sophia. Once the holiest church of Christendom, it was cleansed and converted into the city's chief mosque. Minarets were added over time, Islamic calligraphy covered Christian mosaics, and the echo of the Quran replaced the chant of the liturgy. This was not merely practical. It was a statement. The heart of Byzantium was now the heart of the Ottoman world. Yet Mehmet did not destroy the building. He preserved its grandeur, knowing that its magnificence lent legitimacy to his reign. One of Mehmet's shrewdest moves was embracing diversity. Unlike some conquerors, he did not attempt to erase the Christian or Jewish presence. Instead, he integrated them. He established the millet system, allowing Orthodox Christians, Armenians, and Jews to govern their own religious affairs under Ottoman oversight. He even restored the Orthodox Patriarchate, appointing Gennadios Scholarios as Patriarch of Constantinople, ensuring the loyalty of his Greek subjects. By balancing power between communities, Mehmet ensured stability. Istanbul became not a city of one faith, but of many, united under Ottoman rule. Trade was the lifeblood of Istanbul's rise. Positioned between Europe and Asia, the city became a hub once more. Spices from India, silk from Persia, grain from the Black Sea, and goods from the Mediterranean all flowed through its markets. The Grand Bazaar began to take shape, eventually growing into one of the greatest marketplaces in the world. Merchants from Venice and Genoa returned, albeit now as partners in trade rather than overlords of colonies. Gold, spices, slaves, textiles all passed through Istanbul, enriching the empire and reviving the city's reputation as the crossroads of the world. Mehmet also reshaped the city's image of authority. The Topkapi Palace became not just a residence, but a symbol, a sprawling complex of courtyards, pavilions, and chambers that embodied Ottoman power. From its halls, sultans would govern an empire stretching from Hungary to Arabia. Its treasury glittered with the spoils of conquest. Its harem became a world of intrigue and influence. Its very walls whispered of empire. Constantinople had been the city of emperors. Istanbul became the city of sultans. Mehmet was not only a warrior but a patron of knowledge. He invited scholars from Persia, Italy, and beyond. He studied Greek and Latin texts himself, fascinated by the legacy of Rome he claimed as his own. He built libraries, encouraged translation, and supported architecture and art. Under his vision, Istanbul became not only a capital of empire, but a beacon of culture, where East and West mingled in ways both tense and fruitful. As Istanbul rose, Europeans watched with unease. The city that had once been their ally was now the spearhead of their enemy. From its walls, Ottoman armies would launch campaigns into the Balkans and beyond. But within the empire, Istanbul became a source of pride. It was proof of Ottoman destiny, the jewel in the crown of Mehmet's reign, the place where prophecy met reality. The rise of Istanbul matters because it shows that conquest is not only about destruction, but about creation. Mehmet, too, did not leave Constantinople in ruins. He remade it into something greater. It mattered because it ensured the Ottomans would not be a fleeting power. With Istanbul as their capital, they became a world empire, lasting for centuries. And it mattered because it transformed a Byzantine city into a truly Ottoman one, diverse, powerful, global, enduring. By the end of the 15th century, Istanbul had risen from the ashes. Its walls were strong again, its streets filled with people, its markets alive with trade. Hagia Sophia stood transformed, Topkapi Palace loomed over the Bosphorus, and Mehmet's dream had become reality. The Byzantine Empire was gone, but its city lived on, reborn as the capital of a new world. Some dates in history are just numbers. Others are hinges, turning points where one world closes and another opens. 1453 is one of those rare years that reverberates across centuries. The fall of Constantinople was not just the end of a city or an empire. It was the end of an age, the birth of another, and the beginning of echoes that still sound in politics, culture, and imagination today. With the death of Constantine XI and the fall of the Theodosian walls, the Roman Empire, in any form, ceased to exist. For over 1,000 years after the fall of Rome in the West, Byzantium had carried its flame. It had stood as a living link to antiquity, a bridge between classical and medieval, East and West. When its walls crumbled, the last vestige of Rome fell with them. The line of emperors that had begun with Augustus ended in the dust of a May morning. That alone would have made 1453 monumental. The fall was also technological. Constantinople's walls had withstood 1,000 years of enemies. They fell not to courage or treachery, but to cannons, to gunpowder. Urban's bombardment and Mehmet's artillery marked the arrival of a new age of warfare. Stone fortresses that had once been impregnable were now vulnerable. Armies would march differently, kingdoms would build differently, empires would rise differently. 1453 was a marker between medieval and modern war. For the Ottomans, the fall was the foundation of greatness. Istanbul became the heart of an empire that stretched across 3 continents. From its palaces and mosques, sultans would shape the fate of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa for centuries. The conquest gave the Ottomans legitimacy, wealth, and confidence. It made them heirs not only of Islam but of Rome. And it positioned them as the great rival of Europe, a rivalry that defined geopolitics until the modern age. For Europe, the fall was traumatic and a warning. Christendom's bulwark was gone. Sermons thundered of apocalypse. Kings and popes debated crusades. Traders recalculated routes. Refugee scholars carried Greek manuscripts into Italy, feeding the Renaissance. Out of loss came creativity, urgency, and renewal. The fall forced Europe to confront its disunity, its vulnerability, and, in strange irony, it gave Europe new tools of knowledge just as it faced new threats of conquest. For Greeks, the fall became a scar carried in song and legend. The Marble Emperor, the sealed doors of Hagia Sophia, the lullabies of loss, all kept Constantinople alive in memory long after it was gone in reality. Even today, May 29th is remembered in Greek liturgy and history as a day of mourning. The fall is not a distant event, but a living part of identity, a reminder of endurance, faith, and longing. The echoes of 1453 spread far beyond the city. Russia declared itself the Third Rome, claiming to inherit Byzantium's mantle. European explorers, fearful of Ottoman control of Eastern trade, looked westward and found the Americas. The balance of world power shifted in directions no one could have foreseen. From Moscow to Madrid, Cairo to Calicut, the fall of Constantinople reshaped maps, economies, and imaginations. Above all, 1453 became a symbol of loss, of triumph, of transition. For some, it was the death of the empire. For others, the birth of one. For historians, it marks the close of the Middle Ages and the dawn of the early modern era. For poets and believers, it remains a moment of prophecy, legend, and mourning. The city itself embodied this paradox. It was both ruin and rebirth, both grave and cradle. Constantinople died, Istanbul rose. And in that transformation lies the echo that still resounds. Why does 1453 still haunt us? Because it reminds us how fragile even the greatest powers can be. Because it shows how loss can fuel rebirth. Because it warns that walls, physical or cultural, can crumble before new forces. It also matters because it forces us to ask, what does it mean for a civilization to end? Is it truly gone, or does it live on in memory and culture in the way it shapes those who inherit its legacy? Byzantium died, yet in songs, in Renaissance manuscripts, in Orthodox liturgy, it still lives. More than 5 centuries later, the fall of Constantinople still echoes in politics, religion, and art. Tourists walk its walls. Worshippers pray in Hagia Sophia, once church, then mosque, then museum, then mosque again. Greeks still tell stories of the Marble Emperor. Turks still call their sultan the conqueror. The echo of 1453 is not fading. It is still with us, a reminder that history's turning points never truly end. They ripple, shaping the present as much as the past. On that May morning, as the walls crumbled and the emperor vanished into legend, one world ended and another began. Rome fell. Gunpowder rose. Byzantium died. Istanbul was born. And the world has been living with the echo of 1453 ever since.